A solitary light moved across the moonlit meadow, weaving between the tall grasses that swayed in the midnight breeze. The soft glow of a lantern illuminated the weathered face of Silas Thornton as he drove his shovel into the damp earth. His breath formed small clouds in the cool night air, each exhale carrying the weight of something unspoken. The hole was not particularly deep, just enough for the small wooden box clutched under his arm. Silas paused, looking up at the full moon that bathed the landscape in its silver light. His face, half illuminated, revealed a map of sorrows etched around eyes that had witnessed too much. The other half remained in shadow, like the secrets he was burying. He placed the box in the hole with the gentleness one might use for a fallen bird, his fingers lingering on the worn wood before covering it with soil. Each shovelful of earth fell with finality, the soft thudding sound emphasizing the solitude of the moment. A gunshot cracked through the night, distant but clear. Silas froze, his head snapping toward Willow Creek. The town was nearly 2 miles away, its buildings just visible, silhouettes against the horizon. His hand instinctively moved to his side where no weapon hung, a soldier's reflex that had never fully disappeared. He quickened his pace, tamping down the freshly disturbed earth and scattering fallen leaves over the spot. No marker, no indication that anything lay beneath, just another secret added to the land that had become his refuge and his prison. Another shot rang out, followed by the faint sound of men's voices carried on the wind. Silas extinguished his lantern and moved swiftly back toward his homestead, a modest cabin with a barn and corral set against a backdrop of pines. The limp in his left leg, normally barely noticeable, became more pronounced with his haste. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he reached his porch. A storm was rolling in from the west, and the air had taken on the electric quality that preceded a downpour. Silas cast one last glance at the patch of earth where he'd buried the box, now indistinguishable in the darkness, before turning toward his door. He paused, hand on the latch. Something had changed in the atmosphere. A presence. The fine hairs at the nape of his neck stood on end, the same sensation that had saved his life more than once during the war. Slowly he turned. Through the veil of gathering darkness, a figure emerged on the path leading to his property. A woman, her silhouette unmistakable despite the cloak wrapped around her shoulders. Even from this distance, there was no hiding her condition, the distinctive shape of advanced pregnancy evident in her careful gait. Silas remained still, watching. No one came to his property, especially not at this hour, not unless they were desperate. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as the woman drew closer, her pace quickening with the increasing downpour. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the scene for a brief moment, revealing her fully. A young woman with dark hair plastered to her pale face, one hand clutching her cloak closed, the other protectively cradling her swollen belly. The thunderclap that followed seemed to shake the very ground. The woman startled, slipping slightly on the muddy path, her eyes wide with fear or determination, perhaps both, locked with his across the yard. Another shot echoed from town, closer this time. The woman's head turned sharply toward the sound, genuine terror crossing her features. Her gaze returned to Silas, wary but resolute, as if assessing which threat was greater, the man before her or whatever she was fleeing. Silas hesitated, then stepped off his porch into the rain. "You'd best come inside," he called over the growing storm, "before you catch your death out here." Josephine Ashford had been running for 6 weeks. She had left Philadelphia with only what she could carry, a small valise containing a change of clothes, her grandmother's silver hairbrush, and nearly all the money she had managed to hide away. The rest of her belongings, her previous life, had been left behind in the Bradford mansion when she fled in the dark of night. The stagecoach had been her final hope. Willow Creek was meant to be just another stop on her journey westward, but her condition had made travel increasingly difficult. The constant motion of the coach had caused pain in her lower back, and the baby had been restless, kicking against her ribs with increasing vigor. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver had told her when she asked to be let off outside of town. "Can't be leaving a woman in your condition out here in the middle of nowhere, especially with a storm brewing." "I'll pay extra," she had insisted, pressing coins into his reluctant palm. His expression had been disapproving, but he'd helped her down nonetheless. "There's a homestead about a half mile up that path," he'd said, pointing. "Can't promise they'll take you in, but it's better than being out here when that sky opens up. Now, as the rain soaked through her traveling cloak and dress, Josephine questioned her decision. The distant gunshot had sent a jolt of fear through her. Had they found her already? Had Edgar's men somehow tracked her to this remote corner of the Wyoming territory? When she saw the man on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, with a wild beard and penetrating eyes, her first instinct was to turn back. But there was nowhere to go. The stagecoach was long gone and the storm was worsening by the second. Then she noticed the mud on his clothes, the dirt beneath his fingernails. He had been digging, in the middle of the night. Josephine's heart raced as her imagination conjured dark possibilities. Another shot from town, and her decision was made. Whatever this stranger might be, he was a less immediate threat than the men who might be searching for her. His invitation to come inside hung between them as the rain intensified. Josephine took a deep breath and approached, her hand slipping beneath her cloak to touch the small Derringer pistol concealed in her pocket, a precaution she had taken before leaving Philadelphia. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As she drew closer, she could better see his face, weathered but not unkind, with eyes that held something besides threat. Something like recognition, though not of her specifically. Recognition of someone in need. "Come," he said simply, turning toward the cabin door. "The storm's getting worse." Josephine followed, her steps careful on the slick ground. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard once more, revealing a glimpse of freshly disturbed earth near the edge of the property before darkness fell again. The cabin's interior was surprisingly neat, if sparse. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting warm light across simple furnishings. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a cabinet filled with books, a rocking chair near the fire. A wool rug covered part of the plank floor, adding unexpected comfort to the frontier dwelling. "You can hang your cloak there," the man said, indicating a row of pegs near the door. He moved to stoke the fire, adding another log from a nearby stack. Josephine hesitated before removing her sodden cloak, aware of how her condition would be even more evident without it. She had bound her belly as much as was safe for traveling, but there was no disguising her state. "I don't mean to impose," she began, carefully hanging the dripping garment. "I was told in town this was the way to the Anderson property." It was a lie, but a necessary one. She needed some explanation for appearing on his doorstep. The man paused, giving her a measuring look. "Andersons are another 3 miles west. They'd have sent you on the wrong path." He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit, you're shivering." Josephine sank gratefully into the offered seat, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The warmth of the fire began to seep into her chilled bones, bringing with it a dangerous sense of comfort. She couldn't afford to relax her guard. "May I know the name of my host?" she asked, watching as he moved to a small kitchen area and poured water from a kettle into a cup. "Silas Thornton," he replied, dropping a sachet of tea leaves into the cup before bringing it to her. "And you would be?" She had prepared for this, had practiced her new identity until it felt almost natural on her tongue. "Josephine Ashford," she said, accepting the tea with a nod of thanks. "Though most call me Joe." "You're far from anywhere, Miss Ashford, especially in your condition." His tone was neutral, but his eyes were shrewd, assessing. "Mrs.," she corrected automatically. The simple gold band still adorned her finger, though her husband had been in his grave for nearly 2 months. "I'm a widow." Silas nodded once, accepting this without comment. "The storm's likely to last through the night. You're welcome to stay until morning." The offer should have been a relief, but Josephine tensed. Staying meant questions. Questions led to lies, and lies could unravel. "I wouldn't want to intrude," she began, but a massive thunderclap shook the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. The baby gave a startled kick in response, causing Josephine to wince and place a hand on her belly. Silas noticed but said nothing, moving instead to a chest at the foot of a narrow bed in the corner of the main room. He withdrew a folded quilt, which he brought to her. "There's a small room through that door," he said, nodding toward the back of the cabin. "It's not much, but it's dry. I'll stay out here." The arrangement was more than she could have hoped for, shelter and privacy. Still, caution made her hesitate. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked. Silas paused, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Would you prefer I didn't?" "No, Josephine sighed, her exhaustion momentarily overcoming her wariness. "I'm grateful, truly. It's just that kindness has been Uncommon in my experience of late. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps. Get some rest, Mrs. Ashford. We can sort out your journey in the morning. As he turned away, the sleeve of his shirt rode up slightly, revealing a curious tattoo on his wrist, a simple five-pointed star. A North Star, Josephine realized. The symbol that had guided so many to freedom before and during the war. Interesting. Silas moved to the window, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness, his posture tense, vigilant. What were those shots? She asked, unable to contain her concern. From town, I mean. Nothing that need concern you tonight, he replied, not turning from the window. Willow Creek can be restless at times, especially when the moon is full. The cryptic answer did little to ease her mind, but Josephine was too exhausted to press further. Rising carefully from the chair, she took the offered quilt and cup of tea. Thank you, Mr. Thornton, she said quietly, for your kindness. He nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside. Josephine made her way to the small room he had indicated, closing the door behind her with a sense of temporary reprieve. The room was simple: a narrow bed, a small table with a basin and pitcher, a peg on the wall for clothing. A single window faced east, the glass streaked with rain. Josephine set down her tea and carefully lowered herself to sit on the edge of the bed, her hand moving to the small chain around her neck. Beneath her high-necked dress hung a delicate gold chain, and from it, a small key, the only piece of her old life that truly mattered now. Not for its value, which was negligible, but for what it could unlock. Her fingers closed around it, drawing strength from its familiar shape. She had made it this far. She would protect her child. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would find justice. Outside, the storm raged on, nature's fury matching the tumult in her heart. Silas remained at the window long after his unexpected guest had retired. The storm showed no signs of abating, sheets of rain obscuring his view of the property. Occasionally, lightning would illuminate the yard, revealing nothing but glistening puddles and wind-whipped trees. There had been no more gunshots from town. That was something, at least. He knew he should rest. Dawn would come early, as it always did, bringing with it the endless chores of maintaining the homestead. But sleep had become an elusive companion these past years, especially on nights when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, its light a stark reminder of other nights, other places. His hand moved unconsciously to his left thigh, massaging the old wound that ached in damp weather. A mini-ball at Gettysburg had nearly taken the leg. Sometimes he wished it had. A missing limb would have been an honorable sacrifice, visible proof of his service. Instead, he carried the deeper wounds where no one could see them, festering in the quiet corners of his mind. The woman's arrival troubled him. Not because of the inconvenience. He had space enough, and he was no stranger to offering shelter to those in need. No, what troubled him was the timing. The same night he had finally buried the last remnants of Dr. Silas Reynolds, a pregnant widow appears from nowhere, running from something. It felt like the universe playing a cruel joke, or perhaps offering an unwanted redemption. From his shirt pocket, Silas withdrew the folded paper that had arrived on yesterday's mail coach. A wanted notice, the latest in a series that had been circulating through Western territories for the past month. The likeness was crude but effective, a young woman with delicate features and dark hair. The resemblance to his guest was striking. Wanted for questioning, the notice read. Josephine Elizabeth Bradford, 25, in connection with the death of Charles Bradford of Philadelphia. Believed to be with child. Reward offered for information leading to her safe return to the Bradford family. Below was an address in Philadelphia and the name of the family's solicitor who should be contacted. Silas had recognized her immediately, despite the travel-worn appearance and the simple clothing that replaced the fine lady depicted in the notice. The question was, had she killed her husband, as the Bradfords clearly wanted people to believe, or was she running from something else entirely? It wasn't his concern, he reminded himself. Come morning, he would direct her to the Andersons' place if that was truly where she was headed, or into town if she preferred. His involvement would end there, yet even as he thought it, Silas knew it was a lie. He had spent too many years trying to wash blood from his hands to simply turn away from someone who might need help, regardless of what she might or might not have done. With a sigh, he folded the notice and returned it to his pocket. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. For now, there was the storm, the night, and the memories that never seemed to fade, no matter how deeply he tried to bury them. Moving away from the window, Silas settled into the rocking chair by the fire. From the pocket of his worn leather vest, he withdrew a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, written in a precise hand. Men who had died under his care during the war. Union and Confederate alike. He had begun keeping the list after Antietam, when the dead and dying had been so numerous that their faces began to blur together in his mind. He had feared forgetting them, feared that their sacrifices would be lost in the overwhelming tide of casualties that defined the conflict. So he had written down every name, every age, every hometown when he knew it. And on nights like this, when sleep evaded him, he would read them, a litany of the lost, his own private penance. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the traces of freshly turned earth where he had buried the wooden box. And with it, he hoped, the last vestiges of the man he used to be. Josephine woke to unfamiliar surroundings, momentary panic gripping her until memory returned. The storm, the cabin, the quiet man with observant eyes who had offered shelter. Pale morning light filtered through the small window, suggesting early dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh, clean quality to the air that drifted in through the slightly open window. She rose carefully, her body stiff from the journey and uncomfortable night. The baby stirred within her, a reassuring movement that brought a small smile to her lips despite her circumstances. For a moment, she rested her hand on her belly, feeling the strong kicks that had become increasingly vigorous in recent weeks. "Just a little longer, little one," she whispered. "We'll find somewhere safe soon." After straightening her rumpled clothing as best she could and pinning her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, Josephine opened the door to the main room. Silas Thornton was already awake, or perhaps had never slept. He stood at the small stove, his back to her, tending to something that filled the cabin with the aroma of coffee and frying bacon. He turned at the sound of the door, nodding a simple greeting. "Morning to you," he said. "Thought you might be hungry." Josephine was suddenly acutely aware of how long it had been since her last proper meal. "That's very kind, thank you." She moved to the table where 2 plates had been set out, along with mugs for coffee. The domesticity of the scene felt surreal after weeks of furtive travel and uncomfortable accommodations. "Did you sleep well?" Silas asked, bringing the skillet to the table and dividing its contents between their plates. Bacon, fried potatoes, and eggs. "Better than I expected," Josephine replied truthfully. Despite her wariness in the unfamiliar bed, exhaustion had claimed her quickly. "And you?" Silas shrugged, a non-answer that spoke volumes. The shadows beneath his eyes suggested sleep was not something he found easily. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils against plates and the occasional call of birds outside. Josephine found herself studying her host more carefully in the clear light of morning. Silas Thornton appeared to be in his mid-30s, though the weathering of his face from sun and hardship made precise age difficult to determine. His beard was full but neatly trimmed, dark brown with threads of premature silver at the temples that matched the streaks in his otherwise dark hair. His eyes, she noted, were a striking green, not the warm brown she had thought in the dim light of the previous evening. Most notable, however, was the careful way he held himself. There was a stillness to him, an economy of movement that reminded her of a stalking predator or a prey that had learned to avoid detection. "You have questions," he said abruptly, setting down his coffee mug. "Better to ask them than stare." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed at being caught in her assessment. "I apologize, it's just unusual to find someone so isolated out here." "Is it?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "Seems to me most who come west are looking for exactly that. Space. Solitude. And is that what you sought, Mr. Thornton? Solitude?" Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "Among other things." He pushed his empty plate aside. "Now, where were you really headed, Mrs. Ashford? The Andersons haven't been expecting any visitors that I've heard of." The direct question caught her off guard. "I, was mistaken, perhaps. I'm looking for work, actually, somewhere I can stay until—" She gestured vaguely to her condition. "Work," Silas repeated, skepticism evident in his tone. What sort of work does a lady in your condition seek in a place like Willow Creek? Josephine straightened, pride briefly overcoming caution. I'm educated, Mr. Thornton. I can read and write, keep accounts. I was a teacher before. She stopped, unwilling to reveal too much of her past. Before my husband died. Silas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he rose from the table, moving to the window that faced toward town. Willow Creek isn't particularly welcoming to strangers, he said finally. Especially not since the war. Town's divided still, those who fought for the Union and those who fought for the Confederacy, all trying to live side by side and not always succeeding. And which were you, Mr. Thornton? The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. He turned, fixing her with a look that contained equal parts surprise and wariness. What makes you think I fought at all? The way you move, Josephine replied honestly. The way you watch. And that mark on your wrist, the star. It's a symbol used by the Underground Railroad, isn't it? Silas's hand moved unconsciously to his wrist, covering the tattoo. You're observant, Mrs. Ashford. Too observant, perhaps for your own good. There was no threat in his words, just a statement of fact that sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. I should be on my way, she said, rising carefully from her chair. I've imposed enough on your hospitality. And where will you go? The simple question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Josephine had no destination, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and Philadelphia. Before she could formulate a response, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Silas's hand moved instinctively to his side, that soldier's reflex again, before he crossed to the door. Stay back, he murmured to Josephine as he passed her. She retreated to the far side of the room, heart pounding. Had they found her already? Had someone from town recognized her from the notices? Silas opened the door to reveal a young boy of perhaps 10 years, thin and tow-headed, with a pronounced limp. He leaned heavily on a roughly carved wooden crutch, his face serious beneath a mop of unruly blonde hair. Morning, Mr. Thornton, the boy said, his voice carrying the lilt of the South. Ma sent me to fetch you. Miller Jenkins got his arm caught in the thresher. Real bad, she says. Silas nodded once, his demeanor shifting subtly. Tell your mother I'll be along shortly, Samuel. Who's with Jenkins now? Doc Whitaker was sent for, but he's 3 farms over delivering the Peterson baby. Ma's doing what she can, but... The boy's eyes widened as he noticed Josephine for the first time. Oh, begging your pardon, ma'am. Didn't know Mr. Thornton had company. Mrs. Ashford is just passing through, Silas said before Josephine could respond. Samuel Cooper, Josephine Ashford. The boy attempted a small bow, awkward with his crutch. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Likewise, Samuel, Josephine replied, charmed despite her anxiety. Silas had already moved to a cabinet near the fireplace, from which he withdrew a battered leather bag. Tell your mother I'll be there in 10 minutes. Apply pressure to the wound and keep the arm elevated until I arrive. Samuel nodded, clearly accustomed to such instructions. Yes, sir. With another bobbing nod to Josephine, he turned and made his way back down the path, his progress slowed by his disability, but determined nonetheless. Silas closed the door and turned to Josephine, his expression grave. I have to go. Miller Jenkins isn't a man I particularly care for, but he'll lose that arm without proper attention. Josephine stared at the medical bag in his hand. You're a doctor? I have some experience with injuries, Silas replied evasively. You're welcome to remain here until I return. Should be no more than a few hours. The offer was tempting, far more tempting than it should have been. The cabin represented safety, however temporary. But staying meant more questions, more opportunities for her carefully constructed facade to crack. That's very kind, but I should continue on my way, she said, moving toward where her cloak hung near the door. Perhaps you could direct me to a boarding house in town, somewhere respectable, where I might inquire about work? Silas's expression darkened. There's only one boarding house in Willow Creek, run by the widow Carson. She doesn't take in women in your condition, respectable or otherwise. The blunt assessment stung, though it was nothing Josephine hadn't encountered before in her journey westward. Society's judgment of an unmarried, or in her case, widowed pregnant woman, was harsh and unyielding. I see, she said stiffly. Then perhaps I have a proposition. Silas interrupted, securing his medical bag and reaching for his own coat. I could use help around here, someone to keep the books, tend to correspondence, perhaps start a kitchen garden when the weather permits. The position would include room and board and a small wage. Josephine blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. You're offering me employment? Here. Until the baby comes at least, Silas confirmed, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. After that, we can reassess. It was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with her needs. Suspicion flared. Why would you do this for a stranger, Mr. Thornton? Especially one who arrives under such unusual circumstances? Silas paused at the door, his hand on the latch. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. Because 18 years ago, someone did the same for me when I needed it most, he said finally. Besides, I meant what I said. I could use the help. Before Josephine could respond, he continued, think on it while I'm gone. You're welcome to look around the property, get a feel for the place. He hesitated. Stay away from the north corner of the property, by the old oak. That ground is private. With that cryptic warning, he departed, leaving Josephine alone with her thoughts and the lingering scent of bacon in the quiet cabin. The Miller-Jenkins farm was a modest affair, a single-story cabin with a small barn and a fenced area where a few skinny cows grazed on spring grass. The scene would have been peaceful if not for the sounds of a man in agony coming from within the cabin. Silas approached with his medical bag in hand, his mind already shifting into the familiar patterns of assessment and treatment that had been ingrained during his years of training in war. The mask of Silas Thornton, reclusive rancher, slipped away, replaced by the cool efficiency of Dr. Reynolds, a transformation he allowed himself only in moments of dire need. Mrs. Cooper met him at the door, her careworn face tight with concern. Thank the Lord you've come, she said, ushering him inside. He's lost a fair amount of blood. The interior of the cabin was dim and close, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sour smell of fear. Miller-Jenkins lay on the kitchen table, his right arm a mangled mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. Two farmhands stood nearby, their faces pale beneath dirt and sweat. How long since it happened? Silas asked, rolling up his sleeves as he approached the injured man. About an hour, one of the hands replied. Took us a while to get him free of the machine. Jenkins's eyes fluttered open as Silas examined the wound. Recognition and then disgust crossing his pain-contorted features. Not him, he groaned. Don't want no Yankee doctor touching me. Then you'll likely lose the arm, Silas replied evenly, continuing his assessment. Your choice, Jenkins. Mrs. Cooper stepped forward, her expression stern despite her diminutive stature. Don't be a fool, Miller-Jenkins. Dr. Thornton is the only chance you've got of keeping that arm attached to your body. Jenkins subsided into pained muttering, too weak from blood loss to maintain his objections. Silas opened his medical bag, revealing an assortment of instruments that would have been at home in any surgeon's office. I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey if you have it, he instructed Mrs. Cooper, and someone to hold him down. This won't be pleasant. What followed was a grueling 2 hours of meticulous work, cleaning the wound, removing fragments of metal and wood, suturing torn flesh, and finally setting the broken bones. Jenkins passed out early in the procedure, a mercy for all involved. Throughout it all, Silas worked with the focused precision of a man accustomed to performing surgery under far worse conditions. His hands never trembled, his concentration never wavered, even when sweat beaded on his brow from the effort. Samuel watched from a corner, his young face solemn but unafraid. Unlike many children his age, he seemed fascinated rather than repulsed by the medical procedure. When Silas finally straightened, his back aching from bending over the table for so long, the arm had been cleaned, sutured, and splinted. It was a brutal injury, but with proper care, Jenkins would keep the limb. He'll need the bandages changed daily, Silas told Mrs. Cooper as he washed blood from his hands in a basin. Watch for signs of infection, increased redness, swelling, heat. If the wound starts to smell or if he develops a fever, send for me immediately. Mrs. Cooper nodded, already preparing clean bandages. And his recovery? Will he have use of the arm? Some, Silas replied honestly. He won't be winning any arm wrestling contests, but with time and proper healing, he should regain enough function to work. The fingers were largely spared, which is fortunate. He began packing his instruments back into his bag, each one carefully cleaned and wrapped in cloth. The familiar ritual was soothing after the intensity of the procedure. "You're a godsend, Dr. Thornton," Mrs. Cooper said quietly, ensuring Jenkins couldn't hear. "Don't know what folks around here would do without you, for all that some won't admit it." Silas shook his head slightly. "I'm no doctor, Mrs. Cooper, just a man with some knowledge of wounds. Knowledge that saved more than one life in this valley," she countered. "Call yourself what you will, but God put healing in those hands of yours." Silas did not reply. God, in his experience, had little to do with it. The skill in his hands had been hard-won through years of training and the brutal education of battlefield hospitals, where learning came at the cost of men's lives. "Samuel," he called to the boy, who had been watching the exchange with interest. "Walk with me a ways. I have something to discuss with you." The boy nodded eagerly, reaching for his crutch. Despite his disability, or perhaps because of it, Samuel Cooper had attached himself to Silas shortly after the Coopers moved to the valley 2 years prior. The boy's father had been killed at Petersburg in the final year of the war, leaving Mrs. Cooper to raise her son alone. Outside, the spring morning had warmed considerably, the sun burning away the last traces of the previous night's storm. Samuel hobbled alongside Silas, occasionally using his free hand to push blonde hair from his eyes. "You did well in there," Silas said once they were out of earshot of the cabin. "Not many boys your age could stomach such a sight." Samuel shrugged, though pride was evident in his smile. "Ma says I got a strong constitution. Besides, it was interesting, the way you fix those blood vessels, like tying off little rivers." Silas glanced at the boy, a flicker of recognition passing through him. He had thought the same thing during his early medical training. Before the war showed him that those little rivers could become torrents that no amount of skill could stanch. "I have a favor to ask," Silas said, changing the subject. "A lady arrived at my property last night during the storm. Mrs. Ashford. She's in a delicate condition." Samuel nodded solemnly. "The baby, you mean?" "I saw." "Yes, she may be staying on for a time, helping with the books and such. If she does, I'd appreciate if you'd keep an eye out when you're in town. Let me know if anyone's asking about a woman matching her description." The boy's eyes widened with the conspiratorial thrill of being entrusted with such a task. "Is she in some kind of trouble, Mr. Thornton?" Silas considered the question, unsure himself of the answer. "I don't know, Samuel, but she's alone and with child, which is trouble enough in this world." Samuel nodded, his young face suddenly serious beyond his years. "I'll keep my ears open, sir. Promise." "Good lad." Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden figure, a horse carefully carved with a flowing mane and alert ears. "Thought you might like this. Finished it last week." Samuel accepted the gift with reverent hands, his face lighting up. "It's perfect. Looks just like a real Morgan." "Well, that was the intention," Silas replied, allowing himself a small smile at the boy's enthusiasm. "Now best get back to your mother. She'll be needing help with Jenkins." The boy tucked the wooden horse carefully into his pocket before turning back toward the cabin. "Mr. Thornton," he called over his shoulder. "Them fellas that was shooting in town last night, it was the Garrison brothers again. Sheriff had to lock 'em up for disturbing the peace." Silas nodded, relieved it had been nothing more serious. The Garrison brothers were notorious troublemakers, ex-Confederate soldiers who had never fully accepted the war's end. Their periodic, drunken disturbances were an annoyance but rarely escalated to real danger. "Thank you, Samuel," he called back. "Be sure to tell your mother I'll check on Jenkins tomorrow." As the boy disappeared into the cabin, Silas turned his steps toward home, his thoughts returning to the woman who awaited him there and the decision she would make. Josephine spent the morning exploring the cabin and its surroundings, her natural curiosity temporarily overcoming her wariness. The property was modest but well-maintained, suggesting Silas Thornton was a man of discipline and care, if not wealth. The cabin itself consisted of the main room, her small bedroom, and what appeared to be a storage room off the kitchen area filled with preserved foods and supplies. A ladder led to a loft, a simple space with a bedroll and chest that must serve as Silas's sleeping quarters. Everything was clean but Spartan, bearing the unmistakable mark of a man who lived alone and saw little need for comforts. No photographs adorned the walls, no keepsakes cluttered the shelves. The only personal touches were the bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes and a handcrafted chess set on a side table, signs of an educated mind that valued intellectual engagement despite the isolation of frontier life. Outside, the ranch spread before her in the clear morning light. Beyond the barn and corral stood a small kitchen garden, currently dormant in the early spring. A creek wound through a meadow behind the cabin, and in the distance, tree-covered hills rose against the horizon. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, so different from the brick and cobblestone of Philadelphia. Josephine found herself drawn to the open space, the freedom it represented after months of feeling trapped. She approached the barn cautiously, unsure what she might find. Inside, the space was as orderly as the cabin. Tools hung in their proper places, saddles and tack well-oiled and arranged on stands. Two horses occupied the stalls, a sturdy bay gelding and a more elegant chestnut mare. The mare whickered softly as Josephine approached, stretching her neck over the stall door in greeting. Josephine smiled, reaching out to stroke the velvet muzzle. It had been too long since she'd had the simple pleasure of interacting with horses. At the Bradford estate, she had been permitted to ride occasionally, but always under supervision, always with restrictions. "Hello, beautiful," she murmured, running her hand along the mare's sleek neck. "What's your name, I wonder?" "Athena," came a voice from behind her. Josephine startled, turning to find Silas standing in the barn doorway, medical bag in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he replied, setting his bag down on a nearby workbench. "I said you could look around." He approached, reaching past her to scratch the mare between the ears. The horse leaned into his touch with obvious affection. "She was a cavalry officer's mount," Silas explained. "Bought her at auction after the war. Too fine for farm work, really, but I couldn't bear to see her go to waste." Josephine noted the gentle way he handled the animal, his large hands surprisingly delicate as they checked the mare's legs and hooves with practiced efficiency. "How is Mr. Jenkins?" she asked, recalling the emergency that had called him away. "He'll keep the arm," Silas replied, straightening. "Whether he deserves to is another matter entirely." The blunt assessment surprised a small laugh from Josephine. "Not a friend of yours, I take it?" "Jenkins fought for the Confederacy," Silas said, moving to check on the gelding in the next stall. "He makes his feelings about Yankee sympathizers quite clear whenever the opportunity arises." "And yet you helped him." Silas glanced at her, something flickering in his green eyes. "A man's politics don't change the way bones knit or wounds heal." It was a curiously detached statement for someone who clearly possessed medical training far beyond the typical frontier dweller. Josephine filed the observation away with the growing list of incongruities about her reluctant host. "Have you thought about my offer?" Silas asked, changing the subject as he filled the horse's water troughs. Josephine hesitated. The proposition was both tempting and terrifying. Staying meant establishing a connection, becoming known in the area. It increased the risk of discovery, and yet the alternatives were few and increasingly impractical as her pregnancy advanced. "I have," she replied carefully. "It's generous, but I must ask, what would people think? A single woman living under your roof in my condition, it would invite gossip, surely." Silas shrugged, seemingly unconcerned. "I live 3 miles from town for a reason, Mrs. Ashford. What people think matters very little to me. It might matter to you if it affects your standing in the community." A dry chuckle escaped him. "My standing is already precarious at best. Half the town thinks I'm a Yankee spy, the other half thinks I'm a hermit with unsavory secrets. One more rumor won't change much." Josephine studied him, trying to reconcile the gentle healer who had saved Miller Jenkins's arm with the reclusive figure the townspeople apparently distrusted. "What would my duties entail exactly?" she asked, edging toward acceptance. "As I said, bookkeeping, correspondence, perhaps help with the garden when you're able. I receive medical journals and texts that need organizing. The previous tenant of the property left records in disarray that could use a proper accounting." "Previous tenant? I thought you built this place." Silas paused, a shadow crossing his features. "I acquired it 4 years ago, after the war. The original owner moved on. The evasive answer raised more questions, but Josephine sensed pushing further would be unwelcome. Instead, she focused on the practical. And when the baby comes? We'll cross that bridge when we reach it, Silas replied. Der Whittaker in town is competent enough, though getting on in years. I imagine between the two of us, we can ensure a safe delivery. The casual confidence with which he included himself in her child's birth was both presumptuous and oddly reassuring. It suggested a commitment beyond a simple employer-employee arrangement. Josephine took a deep breath, weighing her options one final time. Staying posed risks, but so did continuing to run. And here, at least, she had found someone who seemed willing to help without immediate judgment. I accept your offer, Mr. Thornton, she said finally. Though I warn you, my knowledge of ranching is limited at best. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. I reckon I know enough for both of us on that score. He extended his hand across the space between them. Partners, then? Josephine took his calloused hand in her smooth one, feeling the strength in his grip. Partners. As they walked back toward the cabin, Josephine noticed a small, freshly turned patch of earth near an oak tree at the northern edge of the property. The area Silas had warned her was private. In the daylight, she could see it was too small to be a grave, though the solemnity with which he had mentioned it suggested something of significance lay buried there. Another mystery in a growing collection. Inside the cabin, Silas moved to the bookshelf, selecting a volume and bringing it to the table. The ranch ledgers, he explained, opening the book to reveal columns of figures and notations. Previous record-keeping was inconsistent at best. Josephine examined the entries, quickly identifying discrepancies and inefficiencies in the accounting. I can certainly improve upon this, she said, professional interests temporarily overshadowing her personal concerns. Though I'll need to understand more about the ranch operations. We'll go through it together, Silas agreed, seemingly pleased by her quick grasp of the material. But perhaps tomorrow. You should rest today, get settled. The consideration in his voice caught her off guard. It had been some time since anyone had shown concern for her well-being. Charles, her husband, had been kind in his way, but distracted, often absent. And after his death, she pushed the painful memories aside. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. I appreciate your consideration. Silas nodded, a moment of awkward silence stretching between them before he spoke again. There's stew from yesterday that can be heated for supper. I need to check the fences on the north pasture before dark. Make yourself at home. With that, he departed, leaving Josephine alone once more in the quiet cabin. She moved to the window, watching as he saddled the bay gelding and rode off toward the distant hills. Only when he had disappeared from view did she allow herself to truly exhale, the tension she had been holding in her shoulders finally releasing. For the first time in weeks, she had a moment of genuine reprieve, a chance to think beyond immediate survival. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the reassuring movement of the child within. We have shelter, she whispered to her unborn baby, for now, at least. It wasn't permanent, couldn't be, but it was more than she had dared hope for when she stepped off that stagecoach the previous evening. As the afternoon light began to fade, Josephine's attention was drawn to the chess set on the side table. It was beautifully crafted, the pieces carved from dark and light wood with remarkable detail. She ran her fingers over the knight, admiring the flowing mane and expressive face of the horse. On impulse, she set up the board, arranging the pieces in their starting positions. Chess had been one of the few pleasures she had shared with her father before his death, and later with Charles during their brief courtship. The familiar ritual brought a measure of comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. When Silas returned at dusk, he paused in the doorway, his gaze falling on the prepared chessboard. You play? He asked, removing his hat and coat. My father taught me, Josephine replied, somewhat self-conscious about the liberty she had taken. I hope you don't mind. The set is beautiful. I don't mind. Silas moved to the stove, checking the simmering stew she had prepared. It's been some time since I had an opponent. Did you carve the pieces yourself? She asked, noting the similarity to the wooden horse he had brought for the Cooper boy. Silas nodded, serving the stew into bowls. During the war, when there was time, keeps the hands busy, the mind quiet. They ate at the table beside the chessboard, the conversation sparse but not uncomfortable. As they finished, Silas gestured to the game. Care for a match? Josephine hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that, though I'm out of practice. They settled on opposite sides of the board, the white pieces before Josephine, black before Silas. The familiar opening moves gave way to a more complex middle game, each studying the other's strategy with growing appreciation. Silas played with the same precision he seemed to bring to all tasks, methodical, thoughtful, each move considered from multiple angles. Josephine found herself enjoying the challenge, her mind engaged in a way it hadn't been since leaving Philadelphia. Outside, the light faded entirely, replaced by the silver glow of the rising moon. Its light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the board. "Check," Josephine said, moving her bishop to threaten Silas's king. He studied the board carefully before moving his knight to block the attack. "You play well. Your father taught you thoroughly." "He believed chess built character," Josephine replied, contemplating her next move. "Said it taught patience, foresight, and the consequences of actions." "Wise man." "He was." Sadness colored her voice as she moved her queen. "He died when I was 16. Influenza." "I'm sorry." The simple condolence held genuine sympathy, drawing Josephine's gaze from the board to Silas's face. In the moonlight, his features seemed softer somehow, the habitual guardedness momentarily absent. "It was a long time ago," she said quietly, "though I still miss his counsel, especially now." Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes as he moved his rook. Loss has a way of lingering, even when we think we've moved beyond it. The observation resonated with an authenticity that suggested personal experience. Josephine wondered what losses Silas Thornton carried beneath his reserved exterior. "Check," he said, his rook now threatening her king. Josephine studied his board, seeing the trap he had laid several moves in advance. With a rueful smile, she tipped over her king in surrender. "Well played, Mr. Thornton." "Silas," he corrected, beginning to reset the pieces. "If we're to be sharing quarters, Mr. Thornton seems unnecessarily formal." The simple offer of his given name represented a shift, however small, toward a more personal connection. Josephine found herself surprisingly touched by the gesture. "Silas, then," she agreed, "and you must call me Joe." Most do, or did, before her life had shattered, before she had become a fugitive, a woman whose very name was now associated with suspicion and scandal. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a rumble of thunder. Another storm was approaching, the spring weather volatile in this region. Silas rose, moving to close the window he had opened earlier for fresh air. As he did, Josephine noticed him glance toward the north corner of the property, attention returning to his shoulders. "You don't care for storms," she observed. "They bring memories," he replied cryptically, securing the latch. "Not all of them welcome." Before she could inquire further, a particularly bright flash lit up the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead. The suddenness of it startled Josephine, causing her to knock over several chess pieces as she jerked in surprise. "I'm sorry," she said, bending awkwardly to retrieve the fallen pieces. "Leave them," Silas said, his voice strangely tight. "It's late. We should both rest." The abrupt shift in his demeanor was jarring, but Josephine recognized the signs of someone retreating from uncomfortable emotions. She had seen it often enough in the mirror over the past months. "Of course," she agreed, rising from her chair. "Good night, Silas. And thank you again for your hospitality." He nodded once, his gaze already distant, focused on some point beyond the window where the storm gathered intensity. In her small room, Josephine prepared for bed, listening to the rain begin to patter against the roof. Through the door, she could hear Silas moving about the main room, restless footsteps, the creak of the rocking chair, the sound of a book being opened and closed. A man haunted by something, just as she was. Perhaps that was why he had offered her shelter. There was a kinship in their respective flights from the POW, though the nature of his demons remained a mystery. As she drifted toward sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the rain, Josephine's hand closed around the small key that hung at her neck. Whatever secrets Silas Thornton harbored, she had her own to protect. Her child's future depended on it. Outside, the storm raged on, a fitting backdrop to the tumult of uncertainty that still churned within her despite the temporary sanctuary she had found. The sound of thrashing and a strangled cry jerked Josephine from sleep. She sat up, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. before registering that the noise came from the main room. Silas. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled continuously overhead. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating her small room with harsh white light. Another cry from beyond her door, wordless but filled with anguish. Josephine hesitated, torn between concern and caution. Whatever demons plagued Silas Thornton in the night were not her business. And yet, a particularly violent crash of thunder shook the cabin, followed by the sound of something or someone falling heavily. Decision made, Josephine rose and wrapped a shawl around her nightdress before opening her door. The main room was mostly dark, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace and the occasional flash of lightning. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust enough to make out Silas's form. He was on his knees beside the rocking chair, his head bowed, hands pressed to his ears as if trying to block out a terrible sound. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a struggle against some invisible constriction. "Silas?" Josephine called softly, unsure if he was truly awake. He didn't respond, didn't seem to register her presence at all. Another flash of lightning, another roll of thunder, and his body tensed further, a low moan escaping him. Josephine approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of what soldiers returning from the Crimean War had called soldier's heart, what doctors now sometimes termed war hysteria. She had seen similar episodes among veterans in Philadelphia, men whose minds remained on distant battlefields long after their bodies had returned home. "Silas?" she tried again, kneeling awkwardly beside him, careful to keep a small distance. "You're safe. You're at your ranch in Wyoming. The war is over." His head lifted slightly at the sound of her voice, though his eyes remained unfocused, seeing something beyond the confines of the cabin. "So many," he whispered, his voice raw. "So many I couldn't save." Understanding dawned, not just a soldier then, a medic, perhaps even a surgeon. It explained his skill with Jenkins' injury, the precision of his hands, the clinical detachment when discussing wounds. "You did what you could," Josephine said gently, risking a light touch on his shoulder. "You're not there anymore. You're here in your home." Another crash of thunder and Silas flinched violently, pulling away from her touch. "Cannon fire," he muttered. "They're breaking through the line. We need to move the wounded." He was fully in the grip of memory now, reliving some terrible battle. Josephine had heard that in such states, it was best to play along rather than contradict the person's perception. "The wounded are safe," she assured him, keeping her voice calm and authoritative. "They've been evacuated. You've done your duty, doctor. Now you need to rest." The use of the title was deliberate, an acknowledgement of what she now suspected was his true training. It seemed to reach him on some level, his breathing slowing slightly as he processed her words. "Rest," he repeated, the word hollow. "There's no rest, not while they keep dying, not while I keep failing." The raw self-recrimination in his voice pierced Josephine's carefully maintained emotional barriers. Without thinking, she reached out again, this time taking his hand in hers. "You haven't failed," she said firmly. "You saved Jenkins today. You're helping people, even now." Slowly, awareness seemed to return to his eyes. He blinked, focusing on her face with growing recognition. "Joe," he said uncertainly, as if unsure she was real. "Yes," she confirmed, relief washing through her. "You were having a nightmare, I think. The storm." Shame crossed his features as full consciousness returned. He withdrew his hand from hers, pushing himself up to sit with his back against the rocking chair. "I apologize," he said stiffly. "You shouldn't have had to witness that." "There's no need for apology," Josephine replied, settling back to sit on the floor across from him, her condition making graceful movement impossible. "The war leaves its mark on many." Silas studied her face in the dim light, wariness returning to his expression. "You speak as if you have experience with this." "My husband fought," she said, offering a partial truth. "He came back, changed. The nightmares were frequent. Charles Bradford had indeed served briefly, though his wealthy family had arranged for him to hold a relatively safe position away from the front lines. His nightmares had been infrequent and mild compared to what she had just witnessed in Silas. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, revealing the leather-bound journal that had fallen from Silas's lap during his episode. It lay open on the floor between them, pages of handwritten names visible. Silas followed her gaze, reaching for the journal with a protective gesture. A record, he said simply, of those I lost. During the war? He nodded, closing the book carefully and setting it aside. It helps, sometimes, to remember them as individuals, not just casualties. The quiet admission revealed more about Silas Thornton than perhaps he intended. Not just a man who had experienced war's horrors, but one who carried the specific burden of having tried, and sometimes failed, to save lives in the midst of that chaos. "Were you a doctor?" Josephine asked directly, sensing that in this moment of vulnerability, he might be more willing to share the truth. Silas hesitated, then sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I was trained as one, yes, before the war, I served as a surgeon with the Union Army." The confirmation of her suspicions should have been satisfying, but instead, Josephine felt only a deepening sadness for the weight this man carried. "And after?" she prompted gently. "After, I couldn't." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Civilian practice felt trivial after what I'd seen, and I'd lost my taste for cutting into human flesh even to heal." "So you came west?" "Eventually, after trying and failing to resume my old life." Silas glanced toward the window where the storm continued unabated. "I thought distance might help, from the memories, from the expectations." "Has it?" A humorless smile touched his lips, some days more than others. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the rain against the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder, now moving away as the storm passed. "What triggered it?" Josephine asked finally. "If you don't mind my asking, was it just the storm?" Silas seemed to consider whether to answer, his natural reticence at war with the unusual openness of the moment. "Antietam," he said finally, "the bloodiest day of the war. It rained afterward, thundered. I worked for 2 days straight, without rest, operating, amputating, trying to save as many as I could. The thunder, it sounds too much like artillery." Josephine nodded, understanding dawning. "And the full moon, you mentioned it bothers you as well." "Surgeons work by moonlight when lamps ran out," Silas explained, his voice distant with memory. "Operating in shadow, hands slick with blood, trying to find the source of bleeding by touch as much as sight. The full moon brings it all back, the smell, the sounds, the feeling of a man's life slipping away beneath my hands." The raw honesty of the confession hung in the air between them, intimate in a way that transcended their short acquaintance. Josephine found herself sharing in response, offering a piece of her own pain. "I understand haunting memories," she said quietly. "After Charles, my husband, died, I would wake in the night, convinced I could still hear him gasping for breath. The sound followed me even after I left Philadelphia." It was the first time she had spoken of Charles's death aloud since fleeing the Bradford estate. The memories rose vividly, her husband's face contorted in pain, his desperate struggle for air, the helplessness she had felt watching him die by inches. "How did he die?" Silas asked, his voice gentle but with an undercurrent of professional interest. Josephine hesitated. This was dangerous territory, too close to the secrets she needed to protect. And yet, something about the shared vulnerability of the moment, the understanding in Silas's eyes, made her want to unburden herself, even partially. "Poison," she said finally, the word barely above a whisper. "At least, that's what I believe." His brother, Edgar, claims it was a heart condition that ran in the family. Silas's expression sharpened with interest. "What were his symptoms?" "Abdominal pain first, then difficulty breathing, confusion." His lips turned blue toward the end. Josephine swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. It happened so quickly, within hours of dining with his family. "And you suspect the brother?" "Edgar stood to inherit everything if Charles died without issue," Josephine explained, unconsciously placing a protective hand over her belly. "When he learned I was with child," understanding dawned in Silas's eyes. "A child who would be the rightful heir instead." Josephine nodded, relieved that he grasped the situation so quickly. "Edgar began to suggest I was unstable, that the pregnancy had affected my mind. He claimed I had become paranoid, delusional. When I found evidence suggesting he had been embezzling from the family business, evidence Charles had been collecting before his death, I knew I wasn't safe. Neither was my child." "So you ran?" "Yes." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "And now Edgar is offering a reward for my safe return, claiming concern for my mental well-being. In reality, he wants control of the child, the last Bradford heir, and me silenced or institutionalized. Silas was silent for a long moment, processing her story. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. You know of the notice, then? It wasn't a question. Josephine felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the room. You've seen it, she realized. The wanted poster. Silas nodded, reaching into his shirt pocket to withdraw the folded paper. He handed it to her without comment. Josephine opened it with trembling fingers, staring at the crude likeness of herself and the damning text beneath. Wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Charles Bradford. The implication was clear. She was suspected of murdering her husband. It arrived yesterday, Silas explained. I recognized you immediately when you appeared last night. Josephine felt ice form in her veins, and yet you still offered me shelter, employment. I've seen enough of injustice to recognize its patterns, Silas replied simply. A wealthy family, a convenient accusation against someone vulnerable, a child's inheritance at stake. It wasn't difficult to read between the lines. Relief warred with renewed wariness in Josephine's heart. You believe me then? I believe that you believe your husband was murdered, Silas said carefully. Without examining him or having access to evidence, I can't say for certain. But your flight makes sense if you genuinely feared for your safety and that of your child. It was a measured response, neither full acceptance nor rejection of her story. Josephine appreciated the honesty, even as she hoped for more definitive support. I should have told you immediately, she said, refolding the notice. About the accusations, I mean. It wasn't fair to bring this danger to your door without warning. Would you have told me, eventually? Silas asked, genuine curiosity in his tone rather than accusation. Josephine considered the question seriously. Yes, she said finally. Once I felt certain you wouldn't turn me in for the reward. But I would have understood if you asked me to leave once you knew. Silas shook his head slightly. I wouldn't turn away a person in need, especially not a woman expecting a child. Whatever the truth of your situation, you deserve safety until the baby comes at least. The simple declaration of support, however qualified, brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to appear more vulnerable than she already had. Thank you, she said softly, for your trust and for sharing your own struggles. I know neither comes easily. Silas looked somewhat uncomfortable with her gratitude, rising to his feet with a slight wince as his wounded leg protested the movement. It's late. We should both try to rest. The storm has nearly passed. Indeed, the thunder had faded to distant rumbles, the rain settling into a gentler pattern against the roof. The immediate crisis, both external and internal, had subsided. Josephine struggled to rise, her advanced pregnancy making it difficult to gain leverage from her seated position on the floor. Without comment, Silas extended a hand, which she gratefully accepted. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her to her feet. For a moment, they stood close, hands still connected, an unexpected intimacy in the simple contact. Josephine felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not fear or wariness, but a tentative warmth, a recognition of shared vulnerability. Silas released her hand first, taking a step back as if suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. A man and woman, virtually strangers, in night clothes, sharing confidences in the dark. Good night, Joe, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I hope you find rest easier now. And you, she replied, moving toward her door. She paused on the threshold, looking back at him. Silas, the nightmares, do they ever stop? A sad smile touched his lips. Not entirely, but they become less frequent, less overwhelming. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to carry them more skillfully. The wisdom in his words resonated with her own experience of grief and loss. Josephine nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before she closed her door. In her bed, listening to the gentle rain that had replaced the storm's fury, Josephine reflected on the evening's revelations. Silas Thornton, or whatever his real name might be, was a man shaped by war and haunted by those he couldn't save. A doctor who no longer practiced except in emergencies. A man who recognized injustice and was willing to stand against it, even for a stranger. And now he knew her secret, or at least part of it. He knew she was fleeing accusations of murder, running from a powerful family that wanted her child. Yet he had offered protection rather than judgment. The realization brought both comfort and unease. Comfort in finding an unexpected ally. Unease because trust was a luxury she had not been able to afford since Charles's death. As sleep reclaimed her, Josephine's hand found the key at her throat once more. Some secrets she would keep, at least for now. The evidence against Edgar remained her only leverage, her only insurance if he found her. Not even Silas's apparent sympathy was enough for her to relinquish that final protection. Outside, the clouds began to part, revealing glimpses of the full moon as it continued its silent journey across the sky, bearing witness to the secrets buried in the earth below and the tentative trust beginning to form between two wounded souls seeking refuge from their respective storms. Spring progressed steadily into early summer, bringing longer days and warmer weather to Willow Creek. The land around Silas's ranch transformed, barren patches giving way to lush greenery, wildflowers dotting the meadows in bursts of color. Josephine's kitchen garden flourished under her care, rows of vegetables beginning to sprout in the rich soil Silas had prepared for her. In the weeks since that stormy night of revelations, a cautious rhythm had developed between them. Mornings began with a shared breakfast before Silas attended to the livestock and fence repairs, while Josephine organized his long-neglected records and correspondence. Evenings often ended with chess or quiet reading by the fire, an unexpected domesticity that neither acknowledged directly for fear of disturbing its fragile balance. The ranch ledgers, once a chaotic collection of hastily scribbled notes, now reflected Josephine's methodical hand. She had discovered a genuine talent for estate management, taking satisfaction in bringing order to Silas's affairs. The small wage he paid her accumulated in a tin box beneath her bed, funds for whatever uncertain future awaited her after the child's birth. Her condition advanced visibly with each passing week, the baby growing stronger, its movements more pronounced. 7 months along now, Josephine found herself both anticipating and dreading the approaching confinement. The child represented both her greatest vulnerability and her most powerful motivation to persevere. "You've done wonders with these accounts," Silas remarked one evening, reviewing the ledger as Josephine prepared supper. "I hardly recognize my own business." She smiled, pleased by the simple praise. "It wasn't so difficult once I understood your system or lack thereof." The gentle teasing came naturally now, a sign of the growing ease between them. Silas acknowledged it with a raised eyebrow, the closest he typically came to expressing humor. "Systems were never my strength," he admitted, closing the book. "Medicine has protocols, clear procedures. Business?" He shrugged, less straightforward. "Is that why you left your practice?" Josephine asked, setting plates on the table. "After the war, I mean." The question ventured into territory they rarely discussed directly, despite that night of shared confidences during the storm. Silas's past remained largely shrouded, revealed only in brief glimpses when circumstances demanded. He was silent for a moment, and Josephine feared she had overstepped. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as preceding reluctant honesty. "Partly," he said finally. "There were other factors. Expectations I couldn't meet. A reputation I no longer wanted." "A reputation as a skilled surgeon would seem valuable," Josephine observed, taking her seat across from him. "Gil isn't everything," Silas replied, his voice distant. "Not when it's built on the bodies of men who trusted you to save them." The raw admission hung in the air between them. Josephine reached across the table, briefly touching his hand in wordless understanding before withdrawing. "Charles, my husband, once told me that we build our lives from the materials at hand," she said quietly. "Sometimes those materials are broken or flawed, but they're what we have." Silas met her gaze, something softening in his green eyes. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "In some ways," Josephine agreed, a familiar sadness washing over her. "In others, terribly naive. He never believed his brother capable of betrayal, despite evidence to the contrary." "Family blinds us," Silas observed, beginning to eat. "Blood ties create obligations, expectations, regardless of merit." There was a personal quality to the statement that piqued Josephine's curiosity. "You speak from experience?" Silas hesitated, then nodded once. "My brother and I disagreed about many things, the war most significantly." He fought for the Confederacy? Josephine guessed, recalling the tension between Willow Creek's divided veterans. He didn't fight at all, Silas replied, an edge entering his voice. Thomas believed the conflict beneath his concern. Stayed in Boston, profited from Army contracts while I waded through fields of dying boys. The bitterness in his tone revealed a wound deeper than Josephine had anticipated. You haven't reconciled? Hard to reconcile with someone who sees no wrong in their actions. Silas shook his head slightly. We exchange obligatory correspondence at Christmas, nothing more. The revelation of a brother, however estranged, added another piece to the puzzle of Silas Thornton. A wealthy Boston family, medical training, a principled stance on the war, all suggesting a background far removed from the solitary rancher he now appeared to be. Before Josephine could inquire further, a knock at the door startled them both. Evening visitors were unusual. Most of Silas's medical consultations came during daylight hours. Silas rose, instinctively motioning for Josephine to move away from the door's line of sight, a precaution they had silently agreed upon, mindful of the wanted notice that might bring strangers with less than honorable intentions. Evening, Mr. Thornton, came Samuel Cooper's voice as Silas opened the door. Ma sent me with news. The boy stood on the porch, his thin face serious beneath his mop of blonde hair. Beside him was a middle-aged man Josephine didn't recognize, tall and distinguished despite trail-worn clothing, with silver-streaked dark hair and perceptive gray eyes. Samuel, Silas acknowledged, then nodded to the stranger. Dr. Whitaker. Thornton, the older man replied, his gaze moving past Silas to where Josephine stood partially concealed by the kitchen cabinet. Forgive the intrusion, but young Cooper here insisted the matter was urgent. Silas hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Come in, both of you. Samuel entered first, his crutch thumping softly on the wooden floor. Dr. Whitaker followed, removing his hat to reveal a high forehead and receding hairline. His eyes settled on Josephine with professional assessment rather than judgment. You must be Mrs. Ashford, he said, offering a slight bow. Samuel has mentioned Mr. Thornton's new housekeeper. I'm Henry Whitaker, physician to Willow Creek's various ailments and injuries. A pleasure, doctor, Josephine replied, unconsciously straightening her posture under his evaluating gaze. May I offer you coffee? Another time, perhaps, Dr. Whitaker said, turning his attention to Silas. We bring somewhat troubling news. Samuel shifted his weight against his crutch, clearly eager to deliver the information himself. There's a man in town asking questions about a woman from back east. Dark hair, expecting a baby, offering money for information. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. Describe him, Silas said, his voice steady despite the tension that had entered his posture. Well-dressed, Samuel reported. City clothes, fancy watch chain, talks like he's better than everybody. Staying at the hotel. Bradford, Josephine whispered, sinking into a chair as her knees threatened to buckle. Edgar Bradford. Dr. Whitaker's eyebrows rose slightly. The name he gave was indeed Bradford. Edgar Bradford of Philadelphia, representing the family's interest in locating their missing daughter-in-law. His careful phrasing suggested he knew more than he was revealing. Josephine met his gaze, searching for signs of judgment or suspicion, finding instead a measured neutrality that offered neither condemnation nor absolution. Did he show the notice? Silas asked, moving to stand protectively near Josephine's chair. Samuel nodded. Posted it at the Mercantile in the saloon. Says he glanced apologetically at Josephine. Says you're unstable from grief, ma'am. That you need medical attention for your own good and the baby's. A sound between a laugh and a sob escaped Josephine. How convenient. The same diagnosis he attempted before I fled Philadelphia. Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashford, if that is indeed your name, I should inform you that Mr. Bradford has specifically inquired about Silas's property. Someone in town may have mentioned the new female resident here. Fear clutched at Josephine's heart. Her sanctuary, however temporary, was compromised. How long before he comes here? He's organizing a visit to outlying properties tomorrow, Dr. Whitaker replied. Ostensibly to introduce himself to prominent citizens. Your ranch is third on his list, Thornton. Silas's expression darkened. Then we have tonight to prepare. Prepare, Josephine echoed, panic rising in her throat. Silas, I need to leave. I can't bring this danger to your door. And go where? Silas challenged. On foot, 7 months pregnant, with Bradford and his men combing the territory? That's not a solution, it's suicide. I agree with Thornton, Darwistaker said, surprising them both. In your condition, flight is inadvisable. The stress alone could provoke premature labor. The medical assessment silenced Josephine's immediate objections, though fear still coursed through her. What alternative is there? If Edgar finds me here, he'll use the legal system, his money, his influence to take me back. Not if the evidence against him is compelling, Silas said thoughtfully. Josephine stared at him, understanding dawning. My word against his would never be enough, not without proof. What proof do you have? Dr. Whitaker asked, his professional interest clearly piqued. Josephine hesitated, her hand moving unconsciously to the key that hung beneath her dress. This was her final secret, her last protection. Yet if ever there was a time to reveal it, I have Charles's journal, she said quietly. He suspected Edgar was embezzling from the family business, documented irregularities in the accounts, and the night before he died, he wrote that he confronted Edgar, threatened to expose him. Where is this journal now? Dr. Whitaker pressed. Hidden, Josephine replied, in a place only I can access. Silas and the doctor exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Josephine couldn't interpret. I'll need to examine it, Dr. Whitaker said finally. If there's evidence of poisoning alongside financial crimes, it strengthens your position considerably. First, we need to ensure Mrs. Bradford's safety, Silas interjected. Samuel, did Bradford bring men with him? The boy nodded solemnly. 2 fellows, mean-looking with guns under their coats. They're staying at the hotel too. Hired muscle, Silas muttered. Predictable. De Wistiger checked his pocket watch. I should return to town before my absence is noted. Bradford has requested my professional opinion on his sister-in-law's supposed condition, should she be found. And what opinion will you give him? Josephine asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. The doctor regarded her steadily. I have yet to conduct an examination, Mrs. Bradford. Until I do, I have no opinion to offer. It was a carefully diplomatic answer that revealed little of the man's true intentions. Josephine found herself studying his face, trying to determine whether he represented an ally or a potential betrayal. Mrs. Ashford has been acting as my housekeeper and bookkeeper, Silas said firmly. She has shown no signs of mental instability during her employment. Quite the contrary, her organizational skills and clarity of thought have been invaluable. The subtle emphasis on her alias and the professional nature of their arrangement was clearly intended to establish their public narrative. Dr. Whitaker nodded slightly, acknowledging the information without committing to its defense. I'll return tomorrow with Bradford, he said, moving toward the door. It would be best if nothing appears unusual or hurried. Maintain your routine. Answer questions directly but without volunteering information. You make it sound like we're preparing for battle, Josephine observed. A sad smile crossed the doctor's weathered face. In a sense, madam, we are. A battle of narratives, of credibility. These can be just as brutal as those fought with bullets and bayonets. His gaze shifted to Silas. Something you understand well, I imagine. Again, that sense of unspoken communication between the men, of shared knowledge that excluded her. Josephine made a mental note to question Silas about it once they were alone. Thank you for the warning, Doctor, Silas said, opening the door. We appreciate the risk you have taken. Dr. Whitaker placed his hat back on his head with a slight nod. I simply follow my oath, to do no harm, to relieve suffering when I can. Samuel, come along. Your mother will be worried. Can I come back tomorrow? Samuel asked, looking between Silas and Josephine with undisguised concern. To help? Silas placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Best stay in town tomorrow, Samuel. Keep your ears open, but don't draw attention to yourself. We'll send word when it's safe to visit again. Though clearly disappointed, the boy nodded his understanding. Yes, sir. Be careful, Mrs. Ashford. That Bradford fellow has mean eyes. The simple observation from a child sent a fresh chill through Josephine. She had seen those mean eyes up close, had watched them calculate and scheme against her for months after Charles's death. After their visitors departed, Silas secured the door and turned to Josephine, his expression grave. We need to prepare. If Bradford comes tomorrow, we'll need a strategy. Josephine nodded, forcing her mind to function past the panic. I should retrieve the journal. It's hidden in my valise, in a false bottom. Silas nodded. Do that. I have preparations of my own to make. As Josephine moved toward her room, she paused, a sudden realization striking her. Dr. Whitaker knows who you really are, doesn't he? That's what passed between you. Silas stilled, his back to her, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Whitaker trained at Harvard Medical School a decade before I did. We never met during our education, but he recognized my name when I arrived in Willow Creek. He's kept my confidence. Your name, Josephine repeated. Then Thornton is an alias? A long pause, then, yes. Will you tell me your real name? She asked quietly. Silas turned, his expression a complex mixture of resignation and resolve. Reynolds, Dr. Silas Reynolds, formerly of Boston General Hospital and the Union Army Medical Corps. The name stirred a vague recollection in Josephine's memory. Reynolds? Charles mentioned a Dr. Reynolds once, a battlefield surgeon known for innovative techniques. He spoke of him with great respect. Something like pain flickered across Silas's face. Your husband was in the medical corps? No, but his father was. Dr. William Bradford served as a consulting physician to the Union Army. He passed away shortly after the war. Silas nodded slowly, as if fitting this new information into some larger pattern. Get the journal, Joe. We have much to discuss before morning. In her room, Josephine carefully extracted her valise from beneath the bed where it had remained since her arrival. The travel-worn leather was scratched and faded, an unremarkable container for the explosive evidence it concealed. With practiced movements, she pressed a hidden catch in the frame, revealing a thin compartment beneath the lining. From it, she withdrew a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Charles's precise handwriting. The sight of it brought a familiar ache to her heart. Charles Bradford had been a methodical man, recording business transactions and personal observations with equal attention to detail. Their marriage, arranged by their fathers to unite two prominent medical families, had begun as a practical arrangement before blossoming into genuine affection. His death had shocked her not only with its suddenness, but with the swift transformation it triggered in the family's treatment of her. Edgar, always coldly polite before, had become her jailer, restricting her movements, monitoring her correspondence, gradually isolating her under the guise of concern for her fragile condition. It was only through the loyalty of her lady's maid that Josephine had discovered the journal hidden in Charles's study, and with it, the damning evidence that suggested Edgar's involvement in both financial fraud and, potentially, murder. Clutching the journal to her chest, Josephine returned to the main room where Silas waited, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the first time she had seen him indulge in spirits. Whiskey? She asked, arching an eyebrow. Medicinal purposes, he replied with a hint of dry humor, setting the glass aside. Is that it? Josephine nodded, placing the journal on the table between them. The last 2 months of Charles's life, his suspicions about Edgar, the discrepancies he found in the company ledgers, and his final entry the night before he died. Silas opened the journal carefully, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting with professional interest. He flipped through several pages before stopping at an entry dated April 17, 1877. Confronted E! Today regarding the missing funds, he read aloud. He denied all knowledge, became defensive when presented with evidence, claimed the discrepancies were clerical errors, nothing more. I remain unconvinced. The pattern is too consistent, the amounts too significant. We'll consult with father's attorney tomorrow if E. does not provide a satisfactory explanation. Silas looked up, meeting Josephine's gaze. And he died that night? After dinner with the family, she confirmed, Edgar had insisted on a private family meal to discuss business matters. But Charles became ill during dessert. Severe stomach pain, difficulty breathing. The family physician diagnosed heart failure, but you suspected otherwise, Silas finished. Based on the symptoms you described previously, several poisons could produce such effects. Arsenic, perhaps, or certain plant toxins. I tried to suggest as much to the physician, but Edgar dismissed my concerns as hysterical ravings. By morning, Charles was dead, and I was being treated as a grief-stricken widow whose mind had been unbalanced by loss and pregnancy. Silas turned to the final entry in the journal, dated the morning of Charles's death. The handwriting was shaky, noticeably different from the careful script of earlier pages. Fell ill after dinner, he read. Suspect not natural. E. Too eager to call Dr. Parker instead of hospital. If anything happens, Joe must take this to Reynolds. He will know. Silas stared at the page, a complex emotion crossing his features. Reynolds, he repeated softly. He meant me. Josephine's eyes widened. You knew Charles? Not well, Silas admitted, closing the journal carefully. I treated his father for pneumonia shortly after the war. William Bradford was a respected physician, one of the few who understood what battlefield surgeons had endured. He spoke often of his sons, Charles the Dutiful, Edgar the Ambitious. The connection between their pasts sent a shiver through Josephine, the sense of invisible threads drawing them together across time and circumstance. Charles must have remembered you, trusted your judgment, she said, though I never had the chance to fulfill his request. Until now, Silas observed, a new determination entering his voice. This journal is compelling evidence, Joe. Charles's documentation of the financial irregularities, his confrontation with Edgar, the timing of his death, it creates a pattern that's difficult to dismiss. Hope flickered in Josephine's chest for the first time in months. Enough to counter Edgar's claims about my mental state? Perhaps, Silas hedged. Much depends on whether we can find evidence of the poison itself. Without that, it remains circumstantial. The poison would be long gone from Charles's body, Josephine said, disappointment clouding her voice. And I have no samples of what might have been used. Silas considered this, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the table. Not necessarily. If Edgar has been using the same substance, he might have brought it with him. Many poisons are difficult to obtain. Once someone finds an effective method, they often stick with it. You think he might try to poison me as well? The possibility sent a wave of fear through Josephine, her hand moving protectively to her belly. I think Edgar Bradford is a man who eliminates obstacles, Silas said carefully. And you and your child represent significant obstacles to his ambitions. The blunt assessment hung in the air between them, stark and terrifying in its implications. What do we do? Josephine asked finally. Silas rose, moving to the cabinet where he kept his medical supplies. We prepare for his visit, maintain the appearance of normality while watching for opportunities to gather evidence. And if he attempts something while he's here, then we'll be ready, Silas replied, his voice taking on the calm authority she had heard when he treated Jenkins' injury. I've dealt with more dangerous men than Edgar Bradford. The quiet confidence in his statement provided more reassurance than elaborate promises might have. Josephine found herself trusting this man, Dr. Silas Reynolds, in a way she had trusted few others since fleeing Philadelphia. There's something else we should discuss, Silas said, turning back to face her. Something I've been considering since you arrived. The sudden seriousness in his tone caused Josephine to tense. What is it? Your legal status, he replied, sitting across from her once more. As a widow in your condition, without family protection, you're vulnerable, not just to Bradford's claims, but to the legal system itself. Josephine nodded slowly. I'm aware. Women have few rights when it comes to property or even custody of their own children. It's why Edgar's strategy is so effective. He doesn't need to prove I killed Charles, only that I'm mentally unfit to care for the child. Exactly, Silas agreed, which is why I've been thinking about a potential solution. He hesitated, seemingly searching for the right words. A marriage of convenience would provide legal protection for both you and the child. The proposal, delivered with clinical detachment, nonetheless sent a shock through Josephine. Marriage to whom? To me, Silas said simply. As your husband, I would have legal standing to protect you from Bradford's claims. The child would be considered mine by law, regardless of biological paternity. Josephine stared at him, struggling to process the suggestion. You would do that? Tie yourself to a woman accused of murder? Claim another man's child as your own? I believe you're innocent, Silas replied, and a child deserves protection, regardless of parentage. The rational explanation did little to diminish the enormity of what he was proposing. It's too much, Silas. I can't ask you to sacrifice your freedom, your reputation. My reputation is already compromised, he interrupted with a touch of wry humor. And as for freedom, We all make choices that bind us in different ways. This one, at least, would serve a purpose I can believe in. Josephine studied his face, searching for signs of reluctance or hidden motives. She found only the steady resolve that seemed to characterize his approach to all significant matters. "And after?" she asked quietly. "After the baby comes, after Bradford is dealt with, what then?" Silas held her gaze. "That would be for you to decide. The arrangement could remain as it begins, practical, respectful, with no expectations beyond mutual support. Or, he left the alternative unspoken, hanging in the air between them like a fragile possibility neither dared to examine too closely. "I need time to consider," Josephine said finally. "It's not a decision to make in haste." "Of course," Silas agreed, rising from the table. "But not too much time. Bradford arrives tomorrow, and our position would be stronger if we had already taken this step." The practical reminder of their immediate threat sobered Josephine. "I'll give you my answer in the morning," she promised, "after I've had a chance to think clearly." Silas nodded, gathering the journal and returning it to her. "Keep this safe. It's our most compelling evidence, regardless of what you decide about my proposal." As she took the journal from his hands, their fingers brushed momentarily. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Josephine, a reminder that beneath the practical considerations lay more complex emotions neither had acknowledged directly. "Good night, Silas," she said softly, withdrawing her hand, "and thank you for everything." A shadow of something unreadable crossed his features. "No need for thanks. Get some rest, Joe. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." In her room, Josephine sat on the edge of her bed, Charles's journal clutched in her hands, her mind whirling with the evening's revelations and Silas's unexpected proposal. Marriage. Even a marriage of convenience would represent a profound commitment, a binding of their fates in ways that extended far beyond their current arrangement. And yet, the practical benefits were undeniable. As Silas's wife, she would gain legal protection that no other arrangement could provide. And what of Silas himself? In the weeks since her arrival, Josephine had come to respect his quiet strength, his principles, the careful way he navigated a world that had wounded him deeply. There was a steadiness to him that provided an anchor amid the storm of her circumstances. But marriage required trust, complete, unreserved trust. Could she give that to any man after what she had endured? The baby kicked vigorously as if offering its own opinion on the matter. Josephine smiled faintly, placing a hand over the movement. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Is Dr. Reynolds a man we can trust with our future?" No answer came except another kick, this one strong enough to make her wince. The child was growing stronger by the day, its arrival now only months away. Whatever decision she made would affect not just her own life, but this new one that depended entirely on her judgment. With a sigh, Josephine carefully replaced the journal in its hiding place and prepared for bed. Sleep would likely prove elusive, but she needed rest to face whatever tomorrow might bring, whether that included a wedding or a confrontation with the man who had driven her from her home and possibly murdered her husband. Morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the small window of Josephine's room. She had slept surprisingly well despite her troubled thoughts, perhaps her body's demand for rest overriding her anxious mind. The scent of coffee and bacon drifted under her door, suggesting Silas was already awake and preparing breakfast. Taking a deep breath, Josephine dressed carefully in her most presentable day dress. A navy blue cotton with white trim that managed to accommodate her growing belly while maintaining a semblance of propriety. When she emerged from her room, she found Silas at the stove, his back to her as he tended to the cooking. He had shaved and trimmed his beard, she noted, and wore a clean white shirt under his usual vest, small adjustments that suggested he too was preparing for their visitor. "Good morning," she said, moving to set the table as had become their routine. Silas turned, his gaze taking in her appearance with quiet appreciation. "Morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than expected," Josephine admitted. "You?" "Well enough." He brought the skillet to the table, serving them both before taking his seat. "Have you considered my proposal?" The direct question, asked in the same tone he might inquire about the weather, brought a small smile to Josephine's lips, despite the gravity of the situation. Silas Reynolds was not a man who wasted time with unnecessary preamble. "I have," she replied, pouring coffee for them both. "And I accept, with conditions." Silas raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. First, it must be understood that this is a temporary arrangement, dissoluble once the threat from Edgar has passed, Josephine said firmly. I won't trap you in a permanent commitment made under duress. Agreed, Silas nodded. Though for appearance's sake, we should maintain the union for at least a year after the child's birth. The practical amendment made sense, though the thought of a year-long charade gave Josephine pause. Second, I retain control of any inheritance that comes to me or the child from the Bradford estate. You'll have no claim on those funds. I have no interest in Bradford money, Silas assured her, a hint of distaste in his voice. Your inheritance is your own and the child's. And third, Josephine continued, meeting his gaze steadily, this remains a marriage in name only. I won't be obligated in ways I'm not prepared for. A flush rose to her cheeks despite her attempt at clinical language. Silas's expression softened with understanding. Joe, he said gently, I would never expect or demand anything of that nature. My offer is about protection, not possession. The simple assurance eased a tension Josephine hadn't fully acknowledged. Then yes, I accept your proposal. Though I'm not sure how we'll manage to arrange a ceremony before Bradford arrives. Judge Wilson can perform civil marriages, Silas explained, rising from the table. He lives just outside town. If we leave within the hour, we can be married and back before Bradford completes his first 2 visits. The brisk efficiency of his plan left Josephine momentarily speechless. This was really happening. She was about to become Mrs. Silas Reynolds, at least in name, less than 2 months after fleeing Philadelphia as Mrs. Charles Bradford. I'll need to pack the journal, she said, focusing on practical details to steady herself. And we should bring the ledgers that show my work here to establish my competence. Silas nodded approval. Good thinking. I'll saddle Athena for you. She has the smoothest gait for your condition. We'll take the back road to avoid being seen from town. As he moved toward the door, Josephine called after him, Silas, wait. When he paused, she asked the question that had been troubling her since his proposal. Why are you doing this? Truly? He turned back, his expression thoughtful. Because 18 years ago, I couldn't save a woman in a situation not unlike yours. She died believing herself alone and unprotected. A shadow crossed his face. I won't make the same mistake twice. The honest answer revealed more about Silas Reynolds than perhaps he intended, not just his capacity for compassion, but the deep-seated guilt that drove much of his behavior. Before Josephine could respond, he continued more lightly. Besides, the ranch runs more efficiently with your organizational skills. It would be a shame to lose such a capable bookkeeper. The deliberate shift to practicality brought a small smile to her lips. Ah, so it's pure self-interest. Entirely, he agreed, the ghost of an answering smile touching his mouth before he headed out to prepare the horses. Josephine moved quickly to gather what they would need. The journal, carefully wrapped and hidden in her satchel, the ranch ledgers showing her neat handwriting and organizational systems, a clean handkerchief that would serve as a token bride's accessory. As she collected these items, the reality of what they were about to do settled over her. Marriage, even one entered as a practical arrangement, carried weight, significance. For better or worse, her life was about to be legally bound to Silas Reynolds's. Strange how the prospect felt less like a sacrifice than a lifeline, a chance to protect herself and her child through alliance with a man whose principles she had come to respect. If circumstances had been different, if they had met in Boston society before the war, perhaps. Josephine cut off the idle speculation. Dwelling on might-have-beens served no purpose. What mattered was the present danger and the practical solution before them. Outside, Silas had saddled both horses and was securing a small pack to his saddle. He turned as Josephine approached, offering a hand to help her mount. The assistance was necessary now. Her advancing pregnancy made even simple movements like climbing into a saddle challenging. Thank you, she said as she settled on Athena's back, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. For everything, Silas. Whatever happens today, I want you to know I'm grateful. He looked up at her, his green eyes serious in the morning light. Save your gratitude until we've dealt with Bradford. We're not out of danger yet. The reminder sobered her, bringing their purpose sharply back into focus. With a nod, she gathered the reins, following as Silas led them away from the ranch toward the hills that would shield their approach to Judge Wilson's property. Judge Wilson's home was a modest cabin set against a backdrop of pine trees, with a small attached office where he conducted legal business. As Silas and Josephine approached, the elderly jurist was outside, splitting wood with remarkable vigor for a man of his years. He straightened as they rode into his yard, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Thornton," he called in greeting, then corrected himself. "Or should I say Reynolds? Word travels, even to old men like me." Silas dismounted, helping Josephine down before addressing the judge. "Wilson, we need your services in an official capacity." The judge's bushy eyebrows rose as he took in Josephine's condition. "I see. A matter of legitimacy, is it?" "A matter of protection," Silas corrected. "Mrs. Bradford is being pursued by her late husband's brother under false pretenses. We wish to marry to secure her legal standing and that of her child." Judge Wilson studied them both, shrewd eyes missing nothing. "The Bradford case. I received inquiries from Philadelphia last month." His gaze settled on Josephine. "You're the widow accused of unstable behavior?" Josephine met his scrutiny without flinching. "I am Mrs. Bradford, yes. The accusations against me are fabricated by Edgar Bradford to gain control of my child's inheritance." "Serious claims," the judge observed. "Do you have evidence?" "Some," Silas replied. "We're gathering more. But time is against us. Bradford is in Willow Creek now, likely to reach my property by noon." Judge Wilson considered this, then nodded once. "Come inside. If you're determined on this course, best to have it done properly." The interior of the judge's cabin was unexpectedly refined. Bookshelves lined with legal texts, a polished desk, comfortable furnishings that suggested a man of education who valued his comforts despite frontier living. "I'll need identification from both of you," Wilson said, moving behind his desk, "and two witnesses." "My identification is complicated," Josephine admitted. "I've been traveling under my maiden name, Ashford, to avoid detection." The judge waved this aside. "Your actual name is what matters for the certificate. As for witnesses..." He moved to the door, calling out, "Martha, could you come here a moment?" A slender woman with silver-streaked auburn hair appeared from what must be the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Yes, Herbert. These folks need to be married with some urgency. Would you stand witness? And perhaps Billy from the stable could serve as the second." Martha Wilson assessed the situation with a single glance, her eyes lingering briefly on Josephine's belly before offering a kind smile. "Of course, I'll fetch Billy." As she departed, Judge Wilson turned back to them. "I don't normally conduct hasty ceremonies, but I've known Reynolds, or Thornton, as he's called himself, for 4 years. He's a man of integrity, whatever name he uses." The endorsement seemed to surprise Silas, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "While we wait for the witnesses," Wilson continued, "perhaps you'd care to explain why a decorated Union Army surgeon chose to disappear after the war, only to resurface as a rancher in Wyoming territory." The direct question hung in the air, challenging in its bluntness. Josephine glanced at Silas, curious herself about the answer. "The war changed many men," Silas replied after a moment. "Some sought glory in its aftermath. I sought anonymity." "Because of what happened at Cold Harbor?" Wilson pressed. Silas stiffened, a flash of something like pain crossing his features. "You're well informed for a territorial judge." "I read the medical journals," Wilson said simply. "Your techniques saved thousands of lives, even if that particular battle was problematic." "Problematic," Silas repeated, a bitter edge entering his voice. "An interesting euphemism for a massacre." Josephine watched this exchange with growing curiosity, sensing they were circling around something significant in Silas's past, perhaps the very event that had driven him west under an assumed name. Before she could inquire further, Martha returned with a young, stable hand, allowing the conversation to shift back to the matter at hand. "Right," Judge Wilson said, retrieving a ledger from his desk. "Let's proceed with the ceremony. Keep in mind, this is legally binding despite its expedited nature. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, even under unusual circumstances." He positioned them before his desk, the witnesses on either side, and opened his legal book to the appropriate page. "Dearly beloved," he began, the familiar words taking on new significance in their unusual context. We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in the bonds of matrimony. The traditional ceremony proceeded with surprising dignity despite its hastiness. When it came time for vows, Judge Wilson paused, looking between them. Do you have rings to exchange? Silas shook his head. We hadn't time to prepare. No matter, Wilson said. The vows themselves are what bind, not the symbols. Josephine's heart raced as Silas turned to face her, taking her hands in his. The moment felt suddenly, unexpectedly intimate, despite the practical nature of their arrangement. I, Silas James Reynolds, he recited after the judge, take you, Josephine Elizabeth Bradford, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. The solemn words, spoken in Silas's steady voice, carried weight beyond their legal significance. Josephine found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the sincerity in his green eyes despite the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. When her turn came, Josephine repeated the vows with equal solemnity, aware of the irony in pledging lifelong fidelity to a man she barely knew, yet feeling a curious rightness in the commitment nonetheless. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, Judge Wilson concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He hesitated, then added with a small smile, you may kiss your bride, doctor. Silas looked momentarily startled, as if this traditional conclusion had not occurred to him. Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks as he leaned forward, his intent clearly to offer the briefest contact necessary to maintain appearances. But when his lips touched hers, something unexpected happened. The simple brush of contact lingered, deepened slightly, becoming something more than mere formality. Josephine found herself responding, her hand rising to rest lightly against his chest as they shared a first kiss that neither had anticipated would feel so genuine. They separated after only a moment, both somewhat flustered by the unexpected connection. Martha Wilson smiled knowingly, while the young stable hand studiously examined his boots. I'll prepare the certificate, Judge Wilson said, tactfully ignoring their momentary discomposure. Mrs. Reynolds, I hope this union brings you the protection you seek. The new name startled Josephine, a reminder of the significant change that had just occurred in her legal status. Mrs. Reynolds, no longer Bradford, no longer Ashford, a new identity to match her new life. As they signed the necessary documents, Josephine felt a strange mixture of emotions, anxiety about the confrontation that still awaited them, relief at the legal protection the marriage provided, and a more complex feeling she wasn't yet ready to examine regarding the man who was now, in the eyes of the law, her husband. We should return to the ranch, Silas said once the paperwork was complete. Bradford could arrive at any time. Of course, Josephine agreed, gathering her satchel. Thank you, Judge Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, for your assistance and discretion. I wish you both well, Martha Wilson said warmly. Marriage under any circumstances requires patience and understanding, perhaps especially one begun as yours has been. The gentle advice, offered without judgment, touched Josephine. We'll remember that, she promised. Outside, as Silas helped her mount Athena, Josephine found herself studying him with new perspective. Her husband. The word felt foreign, applied to this quiet, complex man who had offered protection without demanding possession. What happened at Cold Harbor? She asked as they rode away from the judge's property, curiosity overcoming discretion. Silas's expression closed, the momentary openness of the ceremony replaced by his habitual reserve. A battle in Virginia, 1864. Grant sent wave after wave of men against entrenched Confederate positions. 7,000 casualties in under an hour. The stark numbers hung in the air between them, but Josephine sensed there was more, something personal that connected Silas to that particular horror among the many that had comprised the war. You were there, she said softly. As a surgeon. I was chief medical officer for the 2nd Corps, Silas confirmed, his voice distant with memory. We were overwhelmed, hundreds of wounded arriving faster than we could assess them, let alone treat them. So you developed a system, Josephine guessed, recalling the judge's reference to Silas's techniques. Triage, he nodded, sorting the wounded by severity, treating those who could be saved. making comfortable those who couldn't. Standard practice now, but controversial then. Josephine considered this, understanding dawning. You had to decide who lived and who died. In effect, yes, Silas admitted, his voice tight. I ordered my surgeons to bypass the mortally wounded, to focus on those with survivable injuries. It saved many lives in aggregate, but at a cost. The men who might have had a chance, however small, Josephine finished softly, the ones classified as beyond help. Silas nodded once, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. After the war, my methods were adopted throughout the medical corps. I was praised, offered prestigious positions, lauded as a pioneer. Meanwhile, I dreamed of dying men calling my name, accusing me of abandoning them. The raw confession explained so much. The nightmares, the journal of names, the rejection of his former identity, and the acclaim it carried. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, Josephine said after a moment. Save those you could. That's the rational view, Silas acknowledged. But reason offers cold comfort at 3 a.m. when the faces of the dead visit your dreams. There was no adequate response to such pain. Josephine simply reached across the space between their horses, briefly touching his arm in silent understanding. They rode in companionable silence for a time, each absorbed in private thoughts, the reality of their new legal relationship settling over them like an invisible mantle. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Silas reined his horse to a stop. Whatever happens with Bradford, he said, turning to face her, remember that legally you're now my wife. He has no claim on you or the child. If he attempts to intimidate or threaten, let me handle it. The protective assertion might have chafed against Josephine's independence under different circumstances. Now it provided reassurance. I'll follow your lead, she agreed, though I won't appear cowed or confused. That would only support his narrative. Agreed, Silas nodded approvingly. Present yourself as you are, intelligent, composed, clearly in command of your faculties. And our marriage? Josephine asked. How should we explain its suddenness? The truth or a version of it, Silas replied. We met when you sought employment, developed mutual respect that grew into something more. Your advancing pregnancy hastened the formalities. The simple narrative was plausible enough, particularly in frontier communities where practical considerations often outweighed traditional courtship. And if he asks about Charles, about Philadelphia, you answer truthfully but without elaboration, Silas advised. You were widowed, sought a new beginning away from painful memories. Nothing more unless he forces the issue. Josephine nodded, mentally preparing herself for the confrontation to come. As they continued down the hill toward the ranch, she noticed a wagon already in the yard. Visitors had arrived during their absence. Bradford, Silas murmured, his posture tensing. Earlier than expected. Josephine's heart raced as they approached, her eyes fixed on the elegant carriage with Philadelphia registration. After months of running, she was about to face the man who had driven her from her home, who had possibly murdered her husband, who sought to control her child's future. Silas dismounted quickly, moving to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, he kept hold of her hands, meeting her gaze with reassuring steadiness. Remember, he said quietly, you're not alone anymore. The simple statement carried profound meaning in its context. Whatever came next, Josephine faced it not as a solitary fugitive, but as a woman with an ally, a husband, at her side. Drawing strength from this knowledge, she straightened her shoulders and turned toward the cabin where Edgar Bradford awaited, ready at last to confront the past that had haunted her for so many months. Edgar Bradford stood on the porch of the cabin, his tall figure impeccably attired despite the dust of travel. At 40, he retained the handsome features that characterized the Bradford men, though his were harder, more calculating than Charles's had been. His dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples, his trimmed beard accentuating rather than concealing his strong jawline. Beside him stood Dr. Whitaker and 2 men Josephine didn't recognize, likely the hired muscle Samuel had mentioned, their city clothes unable to disguise their rough purpose. Josephine, Edgar called, his cultured voice carrying across the yard. Thank God we've found you at last. The performance of concern was flawless. The worried brother-in-law relieved to discover his missing family member. Only those who knew him well would notice the cold calculation behind his solicitous expression. Edgar, Josephine acknowledged, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. This is a surprise. Is it? He descended the porch steps, approaching with outstretched hands as if to embrace her. We've been searching for months, my dear. The family has been beside themselves with worry. Silas stepped subtly between them, not confrontational, but clearly establishing a boundary. Mr. Bradford, I presume? I'm Dr. Silas Reynolds. Edgar's smile faltered slightly at the interruption, his gaze sharpening as he assessed Silas. Dr. Reynolds, I was told this property belonged to a Mr. Thornton. It does, Silas replied evenly. I've been living under that name for personal reasons. May I inquire as to the purpose of your visit? The direct question reclaimed control of the interaction, forcing Edgar to explain his presence rather than continuing his performance of concern. I've come to bring my sister-in-law home, Edgar said, his tone suggesting the matter was already settled. She left Philadelphia in a confused state following my brother's tragic death. Her condition, he gestured vaguely toward Josephine's pregnancy, has affected her mind. The family merely wishes to ensure her well-being and that of Charles's child. I see, Silas said, his expression neutral. And these men? He nodded toward the two individuals hovering near the porch. My associates, Edgar replied smoothly. The journey west can be hazardous. One takes precautions. Dr. Whitaker, who had remained silent during this exchange, stepped forward. Mr. Bradford consulted me regarding Mrs. Bradford's condition. I explained that I would need to examine her before offering any professional opinion. That won't be necessary, doctor, Silas said. My wife is in excellent health, both physically and mentally. The deliberate emphasis on my wife landed like a stone in still water, ripples of reaction spreading across the gathered faces. Edgar's expression froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed this unexpected development. Your wife, he repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. Josephine, what is the meaning of this? Josephine stepped forward to stand beside Silas, her head held high. It means exactly what Dr. Reynolds stated, Edgar. We were married this morning by Judge Wilson. I am now Mrs. Reynolds, legally and willingly. Edgar's facade of concern cracked, revealing a flash of genuine anger before he mastered himself. This is preposterous. You're still in mourning for Charles. And in your condition, he turned to Dr. Whitaker. You see, this impulsive behavior confirms her unstable state. On the contrary, Josephine countered calmly, it demonstrates my sound judgment in securing a stable future for myself and my child with a respected physician and property owner. A respected physician who conceals his identity? Edgar scoffed. Who marries a pregnant widow with unseemly haste? This charade only confirms what we've feared, Josephine. You're not thinking clearly. Silas remained unruffled by the accusations. Mr. Bradford, perhaps we should continue this discussion inside. The day grows warm, and in Mrs. Reynolds' condition, comfort is advisable. The pointed reminder of Josephine's pregnancy and her new name visibly irritated Edgar, but he nodded stiffly. By all means. As they moved toward the cabin, Silas murmured to Josephine, keep Charles's journal close. We may need it. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her hand brushing the satchel where the journal remained hidden. Inside, Edgar surveyed the cabin with poorly concealed disdain, taking in the simple furnishings and rustic construction. Quite a change from Beacon Street, Josephine. I can't imagine what possessed you to flee the comforts of civilization for this. Safety, she replied simply, taking a seat at the table. Something I found lacking in Philadelphia after Charles's death. Edgar's expression hardened. If you're referring to those absurd allegations, I'm referring to my husband's sudden illness following dinner with you, Josephine interrupted, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. I'm referring to the convenient diagnosis of heart failure despite symptoms that suggested otherwise. I'm referring to your efforts to have me declared mentally unsound when I question these circumstances. Unfounded paranoia, Edgar dismissed, turning to Dr. Whitaker. You see the delusions she's constructed? Charles died of the same heart condition that took our father. The family physician confirmed it. Dr. Parker is your personal physician, not the family's, Josephine corrected. A distinction Charles noted before his death. Edgar's expression flickered, a brief, telling moment of unease before his confident mask returned. This is precisely the sort of confused thinking that concerns us. mixing up details, constructing conspiracies. The strain of pregnancy coupled with grief has clearly affected your reasoning. Silas, who had been observing this exchange with clinical interest, spoke up. Mr. Bradford, I've spent several weeks in Mrs. Reynolds' company. During that time, she has demonstrated exceptional organizational skills, clear reasoning, and emotional stability despite her circumstances. As a medical professional, I see no evidence whatsoever of mental impairment. With respect to Reynolds, Edgar replied coldly, your judgment in this matter is compromised by your relationship with my sister-in-law. And given your own questionable history, living under an assumed name in this wilderness, your professional assessment carries limited weight. Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat. If I may, I've had the opportunity to observe Mrs. Bradford, or rather, Mrs. Reynolds, during her time in Willow Creek. She has established herself as a competent bookkeeper for the ranch, organized the medical records, and generally conducted herself with the clarity and purpose one would expect of a person in full possession of their faculties. The unexpected support from Whitaker visibly surprised Edgar. You've examined her then? Not formally, the doctor admitted, but in my professional capacity, I have witnessed no behavior that would justify concerns about her mental state. Edgar's jaw tightened with barely suppressed fury. He turned back to Josephine, his tone hardening. This performance is impressive, I'll grant you, but it changes nothing. As Charles's brother and executor of his estate, I have a responsibility to ensure his child is properly provided for. A hasty marriage to a frontier doctor with a questionable past hardly constitutes suitable arrangements. The marriage is legal, Silas stated flatly. And under territorial law, as Josephine's husband, I now have legal authority regarding both her welfare and that of the child. Your executor powers extend to the estate, not to my wife or her child. Her child, Edgar emphasized, is a Bradford, the last of Charles's line. The child has rights to the family estate, which I am bound to protect. How convenient, Josephine observed, that you should be so concerned with an inheritance you attempted to embezzle from while Charles was alive. The direct accusation landed like a physical blow. Edgar's face flushed with anger, his composure cracking. How dare you? These slanderous claims are documented, Josephine finished calmly, reaching for her satchel. By Charles himself before his death. Edgar's eyes fixed on the satchel with sudden intensity. What are you talking about? Josephine withdrew the journal, placing it carefully on the table between them. Charles kept records, Edgar, of the discrepancies he found in the company accounts, of his suspicions about your activities, of his confrontation with you the day before he died. Edgar stared at the journal, recognition dawning in his eyes. Charles's business diary. He kept it with him constantly. He left it in his study the night he died, Josephine explained. Perhaps he knew what might happen, wanted evidence preserved. This is absurd, Edgar scoffed, though his eyes never left the journal. Business notes and random musings, nothing more. Then you won't mind if Dr. Whitaker examines it, Josephine suggested. Particularly the entries from April, including Charles's final note indicating he suspected poisoning and specifically naming you. Edgar's face drained of color. Fabrications. You could have written those entries yourself. The handwriting can be verified, Silas pointed out, and the journal itself provides context that supports Mrs. Reynolds' account rather than yours. A tense silence fell over the cabin as Edgar visibly calculated his options. His gaze darted to his two associates who had remained near the door, then back to the journal on the table. Even if Charles had concerns about the business, he said finally, his voice regaining its smooth control, that hardly constitutes evidence of the wild accusations you're making. A responsible executor questions discrepancies. It's his duty. Is it also his duty to drug his sister-in-law's tea? Josephine challenged. To restrict her movements, monitor her correspondence, isolate her from friends who might support her? Precautions, Edgar insisted, for your own safety, given your increasingly erratic behavior. Mr. Bradford, Dr. Whitaker interjected, these are serious allegations on both sides. Perhaps it would be prudent to allow a neutral examination of the evidence before proceeding further. Edgar's jaw worked as he considered the suggestion. Very well, he conceded finally. I have nothing to hide. Examine the journal if you wish. though I maintain Josephine's interpretation is colored by her condition. Dr. Whitaker reached for the journal, opening it carefully to the final entries. His expression remained neutral as he read, though his eyebrows rose slightly at certain passages. Interesting, he murmured. Charles Bradford specifically mentions symptoms consistent with certain poisons rather than heart failure. In this final entry, he looked up, his gaze moving between Edgar and Josephine. He specifically instructs that the journal be taken to Dr. Reynolds if anything should happen to him. Edgar's composure slipped again. What? Let me see that. He reached for the journal, but Silas moved it beyond his grasp. I believe Dr. Whitaker is conducting an impartial examination, he said mildly. Perhaps we should allow him to continue. Edgar subsided, though the tension in his body suggested a man barely restraining himself. This is ridiculous. Even if Charles wrote such things, he was clearly confused, paranoid. The heart condition affected his thinking near the end. A convenient explanation, Josephine observed. One that dismisses evidence that contradicts your narrative. Edgar's eyes narrowed. And what of your narrative, Josephine? A grieving widow flees her home, abandons her family, takes up with a frontier doctor under an assumed name, and hastily marries him before her late husband's child is even born. Which version seems more credible to an objective observer? The pointed question hung in the air, its implication clear. Viewed from outside, without context, Josephine's actions could indeed appear suspicious or unstable. Perhaps, Silas suggested, the answer lies not in competing narratives, but in physical evidence. Mr. Bradford, would you object to Dr. Whitaker examining the contents of your luggage? If you have nothing to hide, as you claim, such an examination would help clear this matter. Edgar stiffened. My personal belongings are private. I see no reason to submit to such an intrusion. Interesting, Silas observed mildly. You demand Josephine submit to examination of her mental state, but refuse a simple inspection of your possessions. The situations are hardly comparable, Edgar snapped. My sister-in-law's well-being directly affects the Bradford heir. My personal effects are irrelevant. Unless, Dr. Whitaker said thoughtfully, they contain evidence related to the allegations at hand. For instance, medicinal compounds that might corroborate Mrs. Reynolds' suspicions. Edgar's gaze darted briefly to a valise placed near the door, a tell so subtle that only Josephine, who knew his mannerisms intimately from months of wary observation, caught it. My medicine chest contains nothing but common remedies, Edgar insisted. Headache powders, digestive aids, sleep tonics, standard preparations for travel. Then you wouldn't object to Dr. Whitaker examining them, Silas pressed, for peace of mind, if nothing else. Edgar's jaw tightened. This is becoming absurd. I came here to retrieve my brother's widow, not to be subjected to baseless accusations and invasions of privacy. He rose abruptly, signaling to his associates, We're leaving. This matter will be settled through proper legal channels in Philadelphia, where the family has standing. As he moved toward the door, Josephine felt panic rising in her throat. If Edgar left now with the journal's accusations unresolved, he would simply return with more men, perhaps with legal documents from Eastern courts that local authorities might feel compelled to honor despite the marriage. Charles's last words were about you, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. He said, watch Edgar, he'll try to take everything. Edgar froze, his back to her, shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. Slowly he turned. You go too far, Josephine. Charles said no such thing. He did, she insisted, rising from her chair despite Silas's cautioning hand, just before he lost consciousness. He knew, Edgar. He knew what you'd done, what you planned to do. Enough! Edgar's composure shattered entirely, his face contorting with rage. Charles was a fool who couldn't see beyond his books and medical journals. The business was failing under his management. I saved it, built it into something greater, and he repaid me with suspicion and threats. The admission hung in the air, damning in its implications. Dr. Whitaker and Silas exchanged glances, while Josephine felt a grim vindication despite the pain of having her worst fears confirmed. Did you poison him, Edgar? She asked quietly. Edgar's expression shuddered, control reasserting itself too late. Don't be ridiculous. Charles died of heart failure, as the death certificate states. A certificate signed by your personal physician, Josephine reminded him, after you refused my request for an independent examination. This conversation is over, Edgar declared, his tone once again smooth and controlled. Jenkins, Carter, we're leaving. The legal system will resolve this matter. As his associates moved to follow him, Dr. Whitaker stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Bradford, I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave just yet. Edgar paused, his expression darkening. I beg your pardon? As the county medical examiner, Whitaker continued calmly, I have authority to investigate allegations of poisoning. Given the evidence presented in Charles Bradford's journal and your own, revealing statements, I believe further inquiry is warranted. This is outrageous, Edgar sputtered. You have no jurisdiction over matters that occurred in Philadelphia. Perhaps not, Whitaker acknowledged, but I do have jurisdiction over the contents of the medicines you've brought into this territory. Sheriff Wallace is waiting outside, Mr. Bradford. He'll escort you and your associates back to town while we examine your luggage. As if on cue, the door opened to reveal a weathered man in a sheriff's badge. Behind him stood several deputies, their expressions serious. Edgar's face drained of color as he realized the trap that had been laid. His gaze swung accusingly to Silas. You arranged this, all of it. Actually, Silas replied mildly, Dr. Whitaker made the arrangements after our discussion last night. I merely provided the venue. Edgar lunged suddenly toward Josephine, his control finally snapping. You scheming bitch! After everything the family gave you, he never completed the sentence. Silas moved with surprising speed for a man with a damaged leg, placing himself between Edgar and Josephine and delivering a precise blow to Edgar's raw sternum that dropped him gasping to his knees. That's enough, Bradford, the sheriff said, stepping forward to secure Edgar's hands behind his back. Threatening a woman in her condition adds another charge to your growing list. Josephine watched, a complex mixture of emotions washing through her as Edgar was led away, still hurling invectives that grew increasingly desperate. Relief, vindication, and beneath it all, a profound sadness for Charles, whose trust in his brother had ultimately cost him his life. Dr. Whitaker approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You should rest, Mrs. Reynolds. This has been quite an ordeal, and in your condition... I'm all right, Josephine assured him, though she gratefully accepted Silas's supportive arm around her waist. What happens now? We'll examine Bradford's luggage for evidence, Whitaker explained. If we find poison matching the symptoms you described, we'll wire the Philadelphia authorities with our findings. They'll likely exhume Charles's body for examination, though after this much time, traces may be difficult to detect. And Edgar? Silas asked. We'll hold him pending the investigation, the sheriff replied. His associates, too, as material witnesses. They seemed awfully quick to turn on him once the accusations flew, so I expect they'll cooperate to save themselves. Josephine nodded, the reality of Edgar's capture still settling over her. After months of running, of looking over her shoulder, of fearing for her child's future, justice was finally within reach. Thank you, she said simply, looking between Whitaker and the sheriff, for believing me when so many wouldn't. Evidence speaks for itself, ma'am, the sheriff said with a slight tip of his hat. And that journal of your late husband's is mighty convincing. As the lawmen departed with their prisoners, Silas guided Josephine to a chair. You should sit. The excitement isn't good for the baby. She allowed him to settle her, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. The day had contained a lifetime of momentous events, a wedding, a confrontation, and now, perhaps, the beginning of resolution. It's over, she murmured, the realization washing over her like a wave. He can't hurt us anymore. Silas knelt beside her chair, his green eyes serious as they met hers. Not entirely over, he cautioned gently. There will be legal proceedings, testimony required, but the immediate threat has passed, yes. Josephine nodded, her hand moving to her belly where the baby kicked vigorously, as if celebrating its newfound security. And us? What happens now with this? She gestured vaguely between them, indicating their hastily contracted marriage. Silas was silent for a moment, considering the question with characteristic thoroughness. That depends, he said finally. On what you want, Joe. The simple response placed the decision squarely in her hands. No pressure, no expectations, just an acknowledgement of her agency in determining their shared future. I don't know, she admitted honestly. Everything has happened so quickly. The marriage was necessary, practical. But now there's time, Silas finished for her. Time to decide what comes next, together or separately. The word together lingered between them, laden with possibilities neither had fully acknowledged until this moment. Josephine found herself studying Silas's face, the steady green eyes, the lines etched by experience rather than age, the quiet strength that had become her anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Together sounds not unreasonable, she said carefully, at least until we see how events unfold. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. High praise indeed. The gentle teasing broke the tension, drawing a genuine laugh from Josephine, perhaps her first since Charles's death. The sound seemed to surprise them both, a reminder that beyond survival and justice lay the possibility of genuine happiness. I should prepare supper, she said, making a move to rise. It's been a rather significant day. Silas placed a hand on her arm, staying her. Rest. I'm perfectly capable of heating stew without burning down the cabin. The simple domestic exchange felt surreal after the drama that had preceded it, yet profoundly comforting in its normality. Whatever the future held, legal proceedings against Edgar, the birth of her child, the evolution of their unusual marriage, for this moment at least, Josephine had found safe harbor. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Another day ending, but unlike so many before it, this one closed not with fear and uncertainty, but with the tentative promise of justice and new beginnings. Inside the cabin that had become her home, Josephine watched as Silas moved about the kitchen, his actions methodical and assured, and allowed herself to imagine a future where peace might finally be possible, for herself, for her child, and perhaps even for the wounded healer who had offered shelter when she needed it most. The days following Edgar Bradford's arrest passed in a curious mixture of tension and relief. While the immediate threat had been removed, Josephine found herself in a state of suspended anticipation, waiting for legal proceedings to begin, for evidence to be examined, for the tenuous peace she'd found to either solidify or shatter. Dr. Whitaker had telegraphed the Philadelphia authorities with details of their findings. Edgar's traveling case had indeed contained a small bottle of colorless liquid that, when tested, proved to be a potent extract of foxglove, a plant that, in controlled doses, could treat heart conditions, but in larger amounts caused symptoms identical to those Charles had suffered before his death. A clever choice, Silas had observed grimly when Whitaker delivered the news. If detected, it could be explained away as heart medicine, the perfect poison for someone already suspected of having cardiac problems. The discovery had been damning, particularly when combined with Charles's journal and Edgar's own incriminating outburst. Yet Josephine remained cautious in her optimism. Edgar Bradford was a wealthy man with connections throughout the Eastern establishment. Money and influence had a way of transforming even the most compelling evidence into reasonable doubt. July arrived with a sweltering heat that seemed to settle over the ranch like a heavy blanket. At 8 months pregnant, Josephine found the temperatures particularly challenging, her body unwieldy and prone to swelling in the summer warmth. Silas had insisted on adjustments to her duties, limiting her time in the garden to early morning hours and taking over more of the household tasks despite her protests. Doctors make terrible patients, she observed one evening as Silas returned from town with supplies and the latest news about Edgar's case, and apparently equally terrible at allowing others to work when they should rest. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he unloaded parcels onto the table. Fortunately, you're neither a doctor nor a patient. You're a pregnant woman in the Wyoming summer, which calls for reasonable precautions. The matter-of-fact statement, delivered without condescension, made it difficult for Josephine to maintain her indignation. Over the past weeks, she had come to appreciate Silas's practical concern, so different from Edgar's controlling protection or even Charles's well-meaning but distant solicitude. "What news from town?" she asked, sorting through the packages. Flour, coffee, sugar, the staples of their shared life, alongside a surprising addition of lemon drops, a small indulgence she had mentioned enjoying during her childhood. Silas noted her discovery of the candy with quiet satisfaction before responding. Bradford's attorney arrived from Denver. Harrow is his name, reportedly quite skilled at extracting clients from difficult situations. Josephine's heart sank. I expected as much. Edgar wouldn't trust a local lawyer with his defense. Whitaker seems unimpressed, Silas continued, hanging his hat on the peg near the door. Says Harrow spent more time complaining about the accommodations than examining the evidence. That sounds like someone Edgar would hire, Josephine said with a faint smile. Style over substance when it suits him. The Philadelphia authorities have ordered Charles's body exhumed, Silas added, his tone gentler now, aware of the sensitivity of the subject. They'll test for traces of the poison, though after this much time. They may find nothing, Josephine finished, accepting the reality with a calm born of necessity. Edgar was always meticulous about covering his tracks. The journal and the poison in his possession remain compelling evidence, Silas reminded her, and his outburst here didn't help his case. Josephine nodded, arranging the supplies in their proper places, a small domestic ritual that provided comfort in its ordinariness. When will the hearing be held? Next week, assuming the telegraph from Philadelphia arrives with the formal charges. Judge Wilson wants everything properly documented before proceeding. A week. 7 more days of waiting, of uncertainty, of living in this strange limbo where her future and her child's hung in the balance of frontier justice. The baby will come soon after, she observed, one hand moving to her rounded belly where the child shifted restlessly. Perhaps by the full moon in August. Silas's expression softened as his gaze followed her gesture. Whitaker believes you're progressing normally, no signs of complications. The clinical assessment was delivered with a warmth that transcended medical detachment. Over the past weeks, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. The practical arrangement of their marriage had begun to develop tendrils of genuine attachment, fragile but persistent. I've been thinking, Josephine said carefully, measuring coffee beans into their canister, about what happens after the hearing, after the baby comes. Silas stilled, his attention fully on her now. And I find myself reluctant to return to Philadelphia, regardless of the outcome with Edgar. She met his gaze directly. There's nothing for me there but painful memories in a society that would forever view me with suspicion. Where would you go? Silas asked, echoing his question from months ago when she'd first proposed leaving the ranch. This time, Josephine had an answer. I've been considering remaining in Wyoming, perhaps not Willow Creek specifically, but somewhere in the territory. The inheritance from Charles would provide means to establish a small school, perhaps. I was trained as a teacher before my marriage. Silas absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. Wyoming would be fortunate to have you, he said finally, though property in Cheyenne or Laramie would be considerably more expensive than here. Josephine hesitated, then took the plunge into the unspoken question that had hovered between them. I've also been considering the possibility of not dissolving our arrangement immediately. Silas's eyebrows rose slightly, the only visible reaction to her tentative proposal. Go on. The marriage has served its legal purpose, Josephine acknowledged, but there are practical benefits to maintaining it, at least until the child is older. Stability, security, shared resources. She paused, then added more quietly, and I've found our partnership not unpleasant. A smile tugged at the corner of Silas's mouth. High praise indeed. The echo of his earlier teasing broke the tension, drawing an answering smile from Josephine. You know what I mean. We work well together. There's respect, compatibility. More than many marriages begin with. True, Silas agreed, moving to stand nearer to her, his proximity both comforting and somehow electric. And is that what you want, Joe? A continuation of our arrangement for practical purposes? The question was gentle but direct, forcing Josephine to examine her own feelings more closely than she had allowed herself to do. Did she want merely a practical partnership, or had her feelings evolved into something deeper during these months of shared challenges and quiet evenings? I want, she began, then hesitated, the words catching in her throat. After so long guarding her emotions, vulnerability did not come easily. I want to see what might develop, without pressure or false expectations. I want the freedom to discover if what I feel is genuine or merely gratitude in circumstance. Silas studied her face, his green eyes thoughtful. And if it proves to be genuine, then we build on it, Josephine said simply, one day at a time, as we have been doing. He nodded slowly, seeming to find the answer satisfactory. And if not, then we part as friends, with mutual respect and no regrets, she replied, though even voicing the possibility created a curious ache in her chest. Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with characteristic thoroughness. Finally, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that Josephine felt her breath catch. I would like that, he said softly, to see what might develop between us, given time and freedom. The simple acceptance, without demands or grandiose declarations, embodied everything Josephine had come to value about Silas Reynolds. He offered possibility without pressure, commitment without captivity. The moment stretched between them, intimate and charged with unspoken emotion. Josephine found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something more powerful than conscious thought. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Silas stepped back, his expression shifting from tenderness to alert wariness in an instant. Few visitors came to the ranch, especially in the evening hours. Since Edgar's arrest, both had remained vigilant, aware that Bradford's money might have purchased loyalty beyond his immediate associates. Stay back, Silas murmured, moving toward the door with the caution of a man familiar with ambush. Josephine retreated to the far side of the table, her hand instinctively seeking the small Derringer pistol she kept in her pocket, a precaution Silas had insisted upon after Edgar's arrest. Who is it? Silas called through the closed door. Samuel Cooper, Cheto, came the boy's familiar voice. Ma sent me with the urgent news. The tension in Silas's shoulders eased slightly as he opened the door to reveal the tow-headed boy on their porch, his crutch tucked under one arm and his young face unusually serious. Evening, Samuel, Silas greeted him. What brings you out so late? It's Mr. Bradford, sir, Samuel reported, stepping inside at Silas's gesture. He's escaped. The simple statement sent a chill through Josephine, her momentary sense of security evaporating like morning mist. Escaped? How? Samuel turned to her, his expression apologetic, as if personally responsible for delivering such distressing news. Overpowered Deputy Collins when he brought supper. Took his gun and horse, sheriffs forming a search party, but Mr. Bradford's got at least an hour's head start. Silas's expression darkened. Any indication where he might be headed? Samuel shook his head. Sheriff thinks he'll make for the territorial border, try to reach the railway at Cheyenne. Or he could be coming here, Josephine said quietly, voicing the fear that had immediately formed in her mind. To eliminate the primary witness against him. Silas nodded grimly. My thought exactly. He turned back to Samuel. Does your mother know you've come to warn us? Yes, sir, she sent me. Said to tell you she's loading Pa's old shotgun and keeping watch until this is settled. Despite the gravity of the situation, a brief smile touched Silas's lips. Mrs. Cooper is a formidable woman. Thank her for the warning, Samuel. You should head back now. It's not safe on the roads after dark with the Bradford loose. The boy straightened, clearly wanting to appear brave. I can stay, help keep watch. I'm good at spotting movement, even at night. Silas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. I know you are, but your mother needs you more, and I'd rest easier knowing you were safely home. Though visibly disappointed, Samuel nodded his understanding. Yes, sir. Ma said to tell you she sent word to Dr. Whitaker, too. He'll spread the alert in town. Good, Silas said, moving to the cabinet where he kept a rifle. I'll escort you partway back. Make sure the road is clear. Josephine stepped forward. Silas, you can't leave. Just to the ridge, he assured her, checking the rifle's loading mechanism with practiced efficiency. I can see the Cooper farm from there. Make sure Samuel reaches home safely. Bolt the door behind me. I won't be gone more than 20 minutes. The rational part of Josephine understood the necessity. Samuel's safety was paramount, and the boy had risked himself to bring them warning. Still, the thought of being alone, even briefly with Edgar potentially in the vicinity, sent fear coursing through her. "Take this," Silas said, removing a revolver from a drawer and placing it on the table. "You remember how to use it?" Josephine nodded. Weeks earlier, recognizing the potential for danger, Silas had insisted on teaching her the basics of firearms. She had proven a quick study, her natural precision an asset in handling the weapon. 20 minutes, she repeated, steeling herself against the fear. Not a minute longer. Silas's expression softened briefly. Not a minute longer, he confirmed, touching her hand briefly before turning to Samuel. "Let's go, young man. Your mother will be worried." As they departed, Josephine secured the door as instructed, checking windows and moving the revolver to a more accessible position on the kitchen table. With deliberate calm, she continued the evening preparations, lighting lamps against the gathering dusk, setting water to boil for tea, maintaining the routine of normalcy despite the anxiety churning within. Outside, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the yard. The horses in the corral moved restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. Josephine watched through the window as Silas and Samuel disappeared over the ridge that separated the ranch from the main road, the boy's distinctive gait visible even at a distance. Alone in the cabin, Josephine found herself acutely aware of every sound: the creak of the wooden walls as they cooled in the evening air, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wind through the nearby pines. Each noise seemed magnified by her heightened senses, potential harbingers of danger. The baby kicked vigorously, responding to her tension. Josephine placed a soothing hand over the movement. "It's all right, little one," she murmured. "Your father will be back soon." The words slipped out unbidden. "Your father," referring to Silas with a title that, until now, she had reserved in her thoughts for Charles. Yet somehow it felt right, this gradual shifting of roles. Whatever legal and biological realities existed, Silas had stepped into the space of protector and provider, for both her and the unborn child with a dedication that transcended obligation. A sudden noise from the rear of the cabin startled her from these reflections, a faint scraping as a boot against wood. Josephine froze, straining to listen. It came again, more distinct this time. Someone was on the back porch, attempting to be quiet but betrayed by the loose boards Silas had been meaning to repair. Heart pounding, Josephine moved silently to the table, fingers closing around the revolver's grip. If it was Silas returning early, he would have called out, would have approached from the front where he'd departed. The back door handle turned slowly, testing. Finding it locked, the intruder paused. Then came a soft, familiar voice that sent ice through Josephine's veins. "Josephine, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Edgar, his cultured tones carried easily through the door, deceptively calm despite the circumstances of his escape. "Open the door, Josephine. I'm not here to harm you. I just want to talk before this situation deteriorates further." Josephine remained silent, moving to position herself behind the heavy oak table, the revolver steady in her hands. Edgar might claim peaceful intentions, but she had seen the cold calculation in his eyes when his facade cracked, had witnessed the depth of his determination to control the Bradford legacy and her child's place in it. "This misunderstanding has gone far enough," Edgar continued when she didn't respond. "The evidence against me is circumstantial at best. Charles's death was tragic, but natural. You know that deep down." The smooth persuasiveness of his voice was familiar, the same tone he had used to convince the family physician of her unstable condition, to explain away Charles's suspicions, to justify each incremental restriction of her freedom after her husband's death. "The authorities in Philadelphia will never believe these wild accusations," Edgar pressed. "They know the Bradford name, respect our family's position. This territorial justice is a temporary inconvenience, nothing more." Still, Josephine remained silent, calculating. Silas would return soon, but not soon enough. Edgar's patience would wear thin, and when it did... "I'm offering you a way out, Josephine," Edgar said, his voice hardening slightly. "Drop the charges. Return to Philadelphia with me. Your position in society will be restored, your child raised with all the advantages of the Bradford name and fortune. This frontier marriage can be quietly annulled, a temporary aberration caused by grief and confusion." The offer was almost laughable in its presumption. that she would willingly return to his control, would abandon the freedom and security she had found for the gilded cage he had constructed in Philadelphia. No need to answer now, Edgar continued, misinterpreting her silence as consideration. I'll give you until morning to think it over. I have a camp established in the hills, quite comfortable, all things considered. Come find me when you're ready to be reasonable. A final testing of the door handle, then footsteps retreating across the porch. Josephine held her position, suspecting a trick. Edgar Bradford was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully, nor one who left matters to chance when direct action might serve. Her caution proved warranted. No sooner had the footsteps faded than a shattering crash came from the bedroom window, the sound of breaking glass followed by the thud of something heavy landing on the floor. "Forgive the dramatics," Edgar called, his voice now hard and cold, "but time is a luxury I no longer possess, thanks to your machinations." Josephine raised the revolver, aiming at the bedroom doorway as Edgar emerged, a pistol held casually in one hand. He had changed significantly from the impeccably groomed businessman who had arrived at the ranch weeks earlier. His beard was unkempt, his clothing dirty and torn in places, his eyes holding a dangerous combination of desperation and determination. "There you are," he said, stopping in the doorway when he saw the weapon in her hands. "I see Reynolds has been teaching you new skills. How domestic. Take one more step and you'll discover just how well I've learned," Josephine warned, her voice steadier than she felt. Edgar smiled thinly. "Always so fierce, Josephine. It's what Charles admired about you, you know, your spirit. I've found it merely inconvenient." "What do you want, Edgar?" Josephine demanded, maintaining her aim. "You must know you can't escape the territory. They'll be watching every road, every pass." "What I want is what's rightfully mine," Edgar replied, his facade of civility slipping further. "The Bradford legacy, the company, the fortune Charles was too weak to properly steward. Everything I've worked for, sacrificed for." "Including your brother's life?" Josephine challenged. Edgar's expression hardened. Charles was a fool. He had everything, wealth, position, respect, and risked it all over some minor financial irregularities. He would have destroyed the family name with his self-righteous exposé. The casual admission of his crimes, financial fraud if not outright murder, stunned Josephine despite her suspicions. "So you killed him?" "I protected the family interests," Edgar corrected coldly. "As I've always done. Charles was weak, sentimental. The Bradford empire requires stronger hands. And I was just another obstacle," Josephine said, understanding dawning. "Another inconvenience to be removed." "You could have been an ally," Edgar countered. "A properly grateful widow, content with the comforts provided, uninterested in business matters. Instead, you became a liability, asking questions, seeking records, eventually fleeing with evidence that could destroy everything I've built." His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, calculation evident in his expression. "The child, however, remains valuable. The last Bradford heir, properly guided under my guardianship." The implication sent a chill through Josephine's spine. "You'll never touch my child, Edgar." "That's not your decision to make anymore," he said, raising his pistol to match her aim. "Now lower your weapon and we'll discuss this reasonably. I have no desire to harm you, Josephine, but I will not let you destroy what remains of my life." Josephine held her position, mind racing. Edgar stood between her and the only exit not blocked by furniture. Even if she managed to fire first, in her condition, she couldn't move quickly enough to escape. And Silas was still at least 10 minutes away, assuming he was already returning from escorting Samuel. "You won't shoot," Edgar said confidently, taking a step forward. "You don't have it in you. Charles always said you were too gentle for the harsher realities of life." "Charles didn't know everything about me," Josephine replied, her fingers steady on the trigger. "And neither do you." Edgar took another step, his pistol unwavering. "Last chance, Josephine. Lower your weapon and come with me willingly, or I'll be forced to take more decisive action. The choice is yours." The standoff stretched between them, taut with lethal possibility. Josephine knew her options were limited. Edgar was right about one thing: she had never fired a weapon at another human being, despite her practice with targets. Could she pull the trigger when it mattered most? And even if she did, would it be enough to stop him before he returned fire? The decision was made for her by a sharp, sudden pain that lanced through her abdomen, stealing her breath and momentarily breaking her concentration. The revolver wavered in her grip as she gasped, her free hand moving instinctively to her belly. Edgar noticed the lapse immediately, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "It seems my nephew has impeccable timing," he observed, advancing another step. Perhaps he recognizes family when he hears it. Another contraction seized Josephine, stronger than the first, confirming what she had feared since Samuel's arrival with the news of Edgar's escape. The stress, the fear, the physical tension, all had conspired to trigger labor weeks earlier than expected. "It's too soon," she gasped, fighting to maintain her aim despite the pain. "The baby isn't due for another month." "Unfortunate," Edgar said, seemingly unmoved by her distress, "but not insurmountable. Philadelphia has excellent medical facilities, far superior to the frontier butchery you'd receive here." He was close now, close enough that the pistol in his hand was unmistakably trained on her heart. "The weapon, Josephine. Now." Another contraction gripped her, this one strong enough that the revolver slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. Edgar moved swiftly, securing it and tucking it into his belt. "There," he said with cold satisfaction. "That wasn't so difficult, was it? Now we'll need to move quickly. My associates are waiting with a wagon about a mile east. We can be across the territorial border by dawn." "I'm in labor," Josephine protested, clutching the edge of the table as another wave of pain washed over her. "I can't travel." Edgar's expression hardened. "You can and will. The contractions are still far apart. Early stages only. We'll have plenty of time to reach proper medical care." He reached for her arm, his grip painful as he pulled her toward the door. Josephine resisted, another contraction nearly bringing her to her knees. "Edgar, please," she gasped, genuine fear coloring her voice. "The baby will come too soon. If we travel now—" "Enough!" Edgar snapped, his facade of concern evaporating entirely. "I've indulged your hysteria for too long. The child is a Bradford, and Bradfords are resilient. Now move, or I'll carry you myself." As he yanked her toward the door, a new voice cut through the cabin, calm, deadly serious, and achingly familiar. "Let her go, Bradford." Silas stood in the doorway, rifle raised, his expression a study in controlled fury. Behind him the night had fully descended, the rising moon casting him in silver silhouette. Edgar's reaction was immediate. He pulled Josephine against him, pistol pressed to her temple. "Reynolds, right on cue, put down the rifle, or your wife will suffer the consequences." Silas remained motionless, his aim unwavering. "You're not leaving with her, Bradford. Not tonight, not ever." "I don't think you're in a position to make demands," Edgar replied, backing slowly toward the rear door, dragging Josephine with him. "I have nothing left to lose. Can you say the same?" Josephine met Silas's gaze across the room, trying to communicate through the pain clouding her vision. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the last, causing her to cry out despite her determination to remain silent. Something shifted in Silas's expression, a recognition of her condition, a calculation of risks. "She's in labor," he said, his voice level despite the tension evident in his posture. "She needs medical attention, not a cross-country flight." "A convenient claim," Edgar scoffed, "more likely a ploy to delay us until the sheriff arrives." "It's no ploy," Silas insisted, his professional demeanor asserting itself. "Look at her, Bradford. The pallor, the breathing pattern, the posture. As a doctor, I'm telling you she's in active labor. Take her now and you risk both her life and the child's." Doubt flickered briefly across Edgar's features as he glanced at Josephine, noting the perspiration on her brow, the way she hunched protectively around her belly. "Even if that's true, I can't stay. And I won't leave without her. She's the only witness who can testify against me." "Not the only one," came another voice from outside the rear door. Whitaker stepped into view, his own revolver trained on Edgar's back. "I've examined the evidence myself, Bradford. The poison in your possession, your brother's journal, your own damning admissions. Josephine isn't the only one who can place the noose around your neck." Edgar's head whipped around, his momentary confusion allowing Josephine to wrench herself partially free from his grasp. As she stumbled forward, another contraction hit with such force that her knees buckled. sending her to the floor with a cry of pain. The distraction was all Silas needed. With lightning speed, he closed the distance between them, disarming Edgar with a precise strike that sent the pistol flying from his hand. Bradford fought back with surprising strength for a businessman, landing a solid blow to Silas's jaw before Whitaker entered the fray, restraining Edgar's arms. "Enough," Whitaker commanded as Edgar continued to struggle. "It's over, Bradford. The sheriff and his deputies are surrounding the property as we speak." As if to confirm his words, multiple footsteps sounded outside, followed by the authoritative voice of Sheriff Wallace. "Bradford, come out with your hands up, or we're coming in shooting." The fight seemed to drain from Edgar all at once, his shoulders slumping in defeat as the reality of his situation finally registered. Whitaker maintained his grip, nodding to Silas. "See to your wife. I've got him." Silas was already kneeling beside Josephine, his hands gentle as he helped her to a sitting position. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked, professional concern temporarily overriding all other emotions. "3, maybe 4 minutes," Josephine managed between labored breaths. "It's happening too fast, Silas. Something's wrong." His expression remained calm, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "Let's get you to the bedroom. Can you walk?" Before she could answer, another contraction seized her, more powerful than any previous. "No," she gasped when it finally subsided. "I don't think I can move." Silas nodded, immediately adapting to the situation. "Then we'll manage here. Whitaker," he called to the older doctor, "I need your assistance once Bradford is secured." "Of course," Whitaker replied, handing Edgar off to the sheriff and deputies who had entered the cabin. "Bradford's no longer a threat. We can focus on Mrs. Reynolds now." Edgar, his wrists now bound behind him, stared at Josephine with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "This changes nothing," he spat. "The authorities in Philadelphia will never—" "Save it for the judge, Bradford," Sheriff Wallace interrupted, guiding him toward the door. "You've got enough charges against you now to hang 10 men, even without the murder accusation." As Edgar was led away, Josephine felt a curious sense of closure despite the pain racking her body. The man who had killed her husband, who had threatened her child's future, who had driven her across the country in desperate flight, he was finally, truly defeated. But there was no time to dwell on this victory. Another contraction built, stealing her breath and narrowing her world to the immediate physical reality of bringing new life into the world far sooner than anticipated. Silas worked with quiet efficiency, directing the sheriff's wife, who had accompanied the search party, to gather clean linens and hot water. Whitaker joined him after ensuring Bradford was securely in custody, the two doctors falling into the natural rhythm of colleagues with a shared purpose. "The baby's coming too quickly," Whitaker observed after examining Josephine. "Likely triggered by the stress. We'll need to monitor for complications." Silas nodded grimly. "Prepare for possible hemorrhage, and the child may have difficulty breathing if the lungs aren't fully developed." The clinical exchange might have frightened Josephine under different circumstances, but now she found it oddly reassuring, evidence of the skill and experience that would help her and her child through this unexpected crisis. "Silas," she gasped, reaching for his hand between contractions. "If something happens, if I don't—" "Nothing will happen," he interrupted firmly, squeezing her fingers. "You're strong, Joe. Stronger than anyone I've ever known. And I've delivered hundreds of babies under far worse conditions than this." The quiet confidence in his voice steadied her, providing an anchor amid the storm of pain and fear. "Promise me you'll protect the child," she insisted, "no matter what happens to me." Silas met her gaze directly, his green eyes fierce with determination. "I promise to protect you both," he said, "but it won't come to that. Focus on breathing now. The next contraction will be stronger." He was right. The pain built in waves, each more powerful than the last, until Josephine felt her body taking over, ancient instincts superseding conscious thought. Distantly, she was aware of Silas's calm instructions, of Whitaker's supporting presence, of the sheriff's wife holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. But primarily, she existed in a realm of pure sensation. The tremendous pressure, the overwhelming urge to push, the fire that seemed to consume her from within. Time lost meaning, stretching and compressing in strange rhythms dictated by her laboring body. "I can see the head," Silas announced at one point, his professional demeanor temporarily giving way to wonder. Dark hair like yours. One more push, Joe. You're almost there. Gathering her remaining strength, Josephine bore down with everything she had, a primal sound escaping her throat as she fought to bring her child into the world. There was a moment of searing pressure, then sudden release, followed by the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. A lusty, indignant cry that filled the cabin with its life-affirming vigor. A girl, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the tiny, squirming infant on Josephine's chest. A perfect, healthy girl. Despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under, Josephine found the strength to cradle her daughter, marveling at the miniature features that somehow combined Charles's determined chin with her own dark hair and fair complexion. "She's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "So beautiful." Silas knelt beside them, his expression a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and something deeper, more personal. His hand hovered briefly over the baby's head before gently stroking the damp, dark hair. "What will you name her?" he asked softly. Josephine studied her daughter's face, considering. In Philadelphia, she had expected to name a daughter after Charles's mother following Bradford tradition. But that life, those expectations, now seemed to belong to another woman entirely. "Hope," she said finally, the name arising from somewhere deep within. Hope Elizabeth Reynolds. Silas's eyes widened slightly at the use of his surname, a question in his gaze. "She deserves a fresh beginning," Josephine explained, "free from the Bradford legacy and all it would entail." Understanding dawned in his expression, followed by a warmth that transformed his features. "Hope," he repeated, testing the name. "It suits her, Doctor." Whitaker, who had been quietly attending to the afterbirth and other medical necessities, approached with a small smile. Mother and daughter both appear to be doing remarkably well, considering the circumstances. The little one is on the slow side, but her lungs are clearly fully functional. As if to prove his point, Hope let out another vigorous cry, her tiny fists waving in protest at the cold air and unfamiliar sensations of the world outside the womb. "She has her mother's spirit," Silas observed with a hint of pride that startled Josephine with its genuineness. Though not Hope's biological father, he spoke as if the connection already existed, a bond formed not through blood, but through choice and commitment. "We should move them to more comfortable quarters," Whitaker suggested. "Mrs. Reynolds needs rest, and the child should be properly swaddled." Silas nodded, carefully lifting Josephine with Hope still cradled against her chest. The tenderness in his handling, the protective way he carried them both to the bedroom, spoke volumes about his feelings, perhaps more than words could have expressed. As he settled them on the bed, Josephine caught his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and softened the usual guardedness of his features. "Rest now," he said gently. "We'll talk more when you have recovered your strength." But Josephine wasn't ready to surrender to the exhaustion pulling at her. "Edgar?" she asked, needing confirmation of what she already believed to be true. "Secured in the sheriff's wagon," Silas assured her. "Wallace is taking no chances this time. Double guard, iron manacles. He won't escape again." The knowledge brought a profound relief, allowing Josephine to finally relax fully, her body's demands for rest becoming impossible to resist. As sleep claimed her, her last conscious awareness was of Silas sitting beside the bed, one hand resting protectively near Hope's tiny form, his expression one of wonder and resolute commitment. The next days passed in a blur of exhaustion, recovery, and the constant demands of newborn care. Hope proved to be a vigorous baby despite her early arrival, her healthy appetite and strong lungs belying her small size. Silas was a constant presence, his medical training proving invaluable as he guided Josephine through the challenges of first-time motherhood. His hands, once steady with a surgeon's precision on battlefields, now demonstrated equal skill in showing her how to swaddle an infant, how to ease the discomfort of engorgement, how to recognize the different cries that signaled hunger versus discomfort. Word of Edgar Bradford's recapture and the dramatic circumstances surrounding Hope's birth spread quickly through Willow Creek. A steady stream of visitors arrived at the ranch. Miss Cooper with a basket of freshly baked bread and preserved fruits. Samuel, wide-eyed with excitement at meeting the littlest Miss Reynolds. even the normally reserved Judge Wilson and his wife, bearing a handcrafted cradle as a belated wedding gift. "The community has accepted you," Josephine observed one evening as Silas gently rocked Hope to sleep. "Us." He glanced up, a small smile touching his lips. "Frontier towns have long memories for grievances, but surprisingly short ones for unusual circumstances. Once they decided we weren't a threat to their established order, acceptance followed naturally." "And your true identity?" Josephine asked. "No one seems concerned that Dr. Reynolds has replaced Mr. Thornton overnight." Silas shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb the now sleeping infant in his arms. "Most folks care more about what a man does than what name he uses to do it. I've set enough broken bones and delivered enough babies over the years to earn a certain latitude." There was truth in his assessment. The West operated by different rules than Eastern society, valuing practical contributions over pedigree or convention. Still, Josephine suspected there was more to the community's acceptance than mere pragmatism. A genuine respect for the quiet man who had established himself among them through steady reliability rather than grandstanding. "The preliminary hearing is tomorrow," Silas said, changing the subject as he carefully transferred Hope to her cradle. "Wallace came by while you were napping. Judge Wilson will preside, with testimony from those who witnessed Bradford's actions here." Josephine nodded, a familiar tension returning at the mention of legal proceedings. "Will I need to testify?" "Not at this stage," Silas assured her. "Whitaker, Wallace, and I can provide sufficient evidence for the judge to hold Bradford for trial. Your testimony can wait until you've fully recovered." Relief washed through her. Though the immediate danger had passed, the thought of facing Edgar across a courtroom still provoked anxiety she wasn't ready to confront, especially in her weakened state. "And Charles's journal?" she asked. "Will it be entered as evidence?" "Yes, along with the poison found in Bradford's possession and the telegraphed confirmation from Philadelphia that similar compounds were found in his home there." Silas sat beside her on the edge of the bed, his expression serious. "The authorities have also exhumed Charles's body. Initial findings suggest traces of digitalis, the active compound in foxglove, in the preserved tissues. The confirmation of what she had suspected for months should have brought satisfaction." Instead, Josephine felt only a profound sadness for Charles. Brilliant, dedicated Charles, whose life had been cut short by his own brother's greed. "He deserved better," she said softly. "Charles wasn't perfect, but he was a good man. He believed in justice, in doing what was right regardless of personal cost." Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "From what you've told me of him, I believe he would be proud of how you fought for that justice and for your daughter's future." The simple acknowledgement of Charles's place in their story touched Josephine deeply. Unlike many men, Silas seemed unburdened by jealousy toward her first husband, capable of recognizing Charles's virtues without feeling diminished by them. "I've been thinking," she said, shifting the conversation, "about Hope's legal status. If Edgar is convicted of Charles's murder, the Bradford estate will pass to her as Charles's only heir." "A substantial inheritance," Silas observed. "It would secure her future, provide opportunities many in the West can only dream of." "But at what cost?" Josephine countered. "The Bradford name carries weight in Philadelphia society, yes, but also expectations, obligations, the same pressures that constrained Charles, that corrupted Edgar." Silas studied her face, reading the unspoken question in her expression. "You're considering refusing the inheritance on her behalf?" "Not refusing entirely," Josephine clarified, "but perhaps establishing a trust, managed by neutral parties, that would provide for her education and security without tying her to Philadelphia or the Bradford legacy." "A wise compromise," Silas said with approval. "She would have resources without being defined by them." Josephine nodded, relieved by his understanding. "And it would allow us to remain here, to build a life away from the shadows of the past." The casual "us" slipped out unbidden, hanging in the air between them. Since Hope's birth, they had operated as a unit, as a family, without formally addressing the status of their marriage beyond its practical legal function. Silas seemed to recognize the significance of the pronoun. "Is that what you want, Joe?" he asked quietly. "To remain here, to continue our arrangement beyond its original purpose?" The question echoed their conversation from before Edgar's escape and Hope's unexpected arrival. but now carried additional weight. They were no longer discussing hypothetical futures, but making decisions that would shape three lives: hers, his, and their daughters. It is, Josephine said with quiet certainty, not just for Hope's sake, though her well-being is paramount, but for my own as well. She met his gaze directly, summoning the courage to voice feelings that had been growing steadily over the months of their acquaintance. I found something here that I never expected to find again after Charles's death. A partnership based on mutual respect, on shared values, on trust. Silas absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful. And is that enough? Respect, values, trust. These are solid foundations, but traditional marriages are built on love, Josephine finished for him, a small smile touching her lips. On passion, on romantic attachment. He nodded, his gaze steady on hers. I wouldn't want you to settle for less than you deserve, Joe. The simple statement, delivered without pretense or manipulation, embodied everything she had come to value about Silas Reynolds. Even now, with their lives so deeply intertwined, he placed her happiness above his own desires. What if I told you, Josephine said carefully, that what began as practical arrangement has become something more, at least for me? A stillness came over Silas, a focused attention that reminded her of his concentration when treating a patient or solving a complex problem. More in what way? In every way, she admitted, vulnerability making her voice softer. I find myself thinking of you when we're apart, taking pleasure in your company when we're together. I admire your integrity, your quiet strength, the careful way you move through the world. And yes, I feel an attachment that goes beyond friendship or convenient partnership. The confession hung between them, honest and unadorned. Josephine waited, heart racing, for his response. Silas moved closer, taking her hands in his. Since you arrived that night in the rain, he said, his voice low and serious, I've felt as if something long dormant within me was slowly awakening. Something I thought had died on those battlefields with the men I couldn't save. His fingers tightened gently around hers, the contact grounding them both in the moment's significance. I told myself it was merely the satisfaction of being useful again, of having purpose beyond mere survival. But it was more than that, Joe. It was you, your courage, your resilience, the way you fought for justice instead of surrendering to circumstances. And now, Josephine asked, hardly daring to breathe. Now, Silas continued, his green eyes warm with emotion, I find myself contemplating a future I never thought possible. A life not defined by the men I couldn't save, but by the family I can protect and cherish. If you'll have me, not just as a legal guardian for Hope or a practical partner for yourself, but as a husband in truth as well as name. Joy bloomed in Josephine's chest, unexpected and overwhelming in its intensity. I would have you in all those ways, Silas Reynolds, she whispered, as guardian, partner, and husband, today and all the days to come. The kiss that followed was different from their brief exchange at the judge's office. Not a formal sealing of a practical arrangement, but a genuine expression of connection, of shared feeling, of possibility. Gentle at first, then deepening as months of unacknowledged attraction found release in this moment of honest recognition. From her cradle, Hope let out a sudden, indignant cry, as if protesting being excluded from this significant moment. Josephine and Silas broke apart, shared laughter replacing the intensity of the previous moment. She has impeccable timing, Silas observed wryly, rising to check on the infant. Like her father, Josephine replied without thinking, then paused, realizing the potential ambiguity in her statement. Silas looked back at her, a question in his eyes. Charles? Josephine considered this, then shook her head slowly. Hope will know of Charles, of course, will understand his place in her history, his blood in her veins. But a father is more than biology, Silas. A father is the man who guides, who protects, who loves unconditionally. In every way that matters, you are already becoming that man for her. The naked emotion that crossed Silas's features at her words was more eloquent than any verbal response could have been. He lifted Hope carefully from her cradle, cradling her against his chest with natural ease. Then I will strive to be worthy of that title, he said softly, returning to sit beside Josephine with their daughter between them. For both of you. As Hope quieted, soothed by his steady heartbeat, Josephine felt a sense of rightness settle over her, a completion of the journey that had begun in fear and desperation, but now culminated in this moment of unexpected grace. Outside, the waxing moon rose over the Wyoming hills, its light streaming through the window to illuminate the small family gathered on the bed. The same moon that had witnessed Silas burying his past, that had shone down on Josephine's desperate flight from Philadelphia, now blessed this new beginning with its silver radiance. 5 years later, Josephine stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching as Silas and Hope returned from checking fence lines. At 5, Hope was the image of her mother, dark-haired and determined, but she had adopted many of Silas's mannerisms, from the way she sat a horse to her thoughtful consideration before speaking. "Mama," Hope called, spotting Josephine on the porch. "Papa let me fix the fence all by myself." "With a little help," Silas corrected, swinging down from his horse before lifting Hope to the ground. The proud affection in his expression as he watched his daughter race toward the porch spoke volumes about the bond that had formed between them, a connection built not through blood, but through countless small moments of care and guidance. Josephine smiled, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child, this one conceived in love on their second wedding anniversary, was due in less than a month. "I'm sure you did wonderfully, sweetheart," she said as Hope bounded up the steps to place a small hand on her mother's stomach. "Is my brother moving today?" Hope asked eagerly. "Sister," Silas corrected with a smile, joining them on the porch. They had decided not to argue about the baby's gender, each playfully insisting on their preference. "Brother," Hope maintained stubbornly, making Silas chuckle as he dropped a kiss on Josephine's forehead before bending to do the same to Hope. "Go wash up for supper, Wildcat," he said, using the nickname he'd given her when she first began toddling around the ranch with fearless curiosity. "Samuel is coming for dinner." As Hope scampered inside, Silas drew Josephine into his arms, his hand joining hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Ready to not be pregnant anymore," Josephine admitted with a rueful smile. "But happy." Silas's expression softened as he looked at her. 5 years had etched a few more lines around his eyes, but had only deepened the bond between them. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had blossomed into something neither could have anticipated, a love that had grown steadily stronger with each passing season. "Any word from Philadelphia?" he asked, knowing she had received a letter earlier that day. Josephine shook her head. "Just the usual updates from the trust administrators. Hope's inheritance continues to grow, though I suspect she'll be more interested in horses than stock portfolios for many years to come." Edgar Bradford had been found guilty of his brother's murder, the evidence from Charles's journal in the poison samples proving conclusive once properly examined. His execution had brought a somber closure rather than satisfaction, a final severing of Hope's connection to the Bradford legacy of ambition and betrayal. The Bradford estate, as Josephine had arranged, was held in trust for Hope until her 25th birthday, managed by a committee of Charles's most trusted colleagues from the medical college. The arrangement provided security without demanding conformity to Philadelphia society's expectations, freedom to choose her own path when the time came. "Samuel's looking forward to showing her the new foal," Silas commented, changing the subject. The Cooper boy, now a young man of 15, had become like an older brother to Hope, his early physical challenges never limiting his horsemanship or his gentle patience with the energetic child. "She talks of nothing else," Josephine laughed. "I believe we're raising a horse trainer rather than a proper young lady." "Perish the thought," Silas replied with mock horror. "A daughter of ours defying convention? Unimaginable." The shared joke acknowledged their own unconventional path, the widow and the reclusive doctor building a life from the broken pieces of their respective pasts. Together they had transformed Silas's isolated homestead into a thriving ranch that also served as an unofficial medical station for the surrounding area. Silas no longer hid his surgical skills, though he maintained a selective practice focused on those most in need rather than seeking the professional acclaim that had once been his burden. Josephine, for her part, had established a small school in the renovated barn, teaching the children of neighboring ranches alongside Hope. Her Philadelphia education, once a mere social accomplishment, now served a practical purpose in a community where formal learning was often sacrificed to the immediate demands of frontier survival. "Penny for your thoughts," Silas murmured, as the setting sun bathed the ranch in golden light. Josephine smiled up at the man who had become her world. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you happened to be home that night when a desperate pregnant woman appeared on your doorstep." Silas shook his head, his eyes warm with love. "Wasn't fortune, Joe. Some things are just meant to be." As they followed their daughter inside, Josephine knew he was right. Through all the hardship and fear, through rejection and danger, she had found her way exactly where she was meant to be. In Silas's arms, she had found not just shelter from the storm, but the courage to build a life beyond it. A life where "come home" wasn't just an invitation, but a promise kept day after day, year after year, for all the days to come. Outside, the waxing moon began its ascent over the Wyoming hills, bearing silent witness to the oath made beneath its light all those years ago. An oath fulfilled not through legal obligation, but through the rarer, more precious bond of freely given love.